Welcome to the crash course. What you're about to view is a highly condensed version of a seminar that I've been giving for roughly 4 years, which consists of 6 to 8 hours of material. The crash course seeks to help you understand the nature of some extremely serious challenges and risks to our economy and your future prosperity that exist. Hello, my name is Chris Martinson, and I'm going to be your host for this series. The crash course weaves together a number of seemingly disparate topics into a single story. We will discuss the economy, energy, and the environment, because it's where these fields overlap and intersect that the greatest story of any generation will get told. By the conclusion of this presentation, you will understand and be thinking about the economy in a whole new way. I'm going to provide you with a framework that will clarify what, for many people, is a deeply confusing subject. The information in this mini-course took me several years to gather and develop into this highly condensed story. I must warn you, this will not be easy for some of you, and I know this from watching the reactions of numerous audience members over the years. We're talking about some very large changes, which are, admittedly, hard to get one's mind around. I am going to try and change your mind. I might even challenge some of your most closely held beliefs. And I'm going to try and convince you that it's past time for you to learn, pay attention, and take actions. I recommend that you take the crash course from the beginning to end, at least once, and then revisit it as necessary. At any time, you can speed through a slide by operating the slider at the bottom. Or you may skip ahead to any slide by clicking one of the numbers all the way at the top. With your help and feedback, we will be improving this presentation. If you note anything that's in error, that needs improving, or strikes you as excellent, please let me know. Some of this material is my own original thinking, but most of it is the work of others, which I have gathered. This presentation should be considered the work of interested and aware people everywhere. I want you to take the crash course at your own pace. I built it so that you could rewind sections that weren't clear to listen to them again. I deeply care that you get this material. I think it's very important to distinguish between facts, opinions, and beliefs. So I'm going to try very hard to be crystal clear when I am presenting facts versus stating opinion or communicating my beliefs. So let me be right up front about this. I hold 3 beliefs, which I'm going to share with you, and then spend the rest of our time showing you how I got to these beliefs. The first is that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. And why is this important? Because we tend to base our view of the future on our most recent experience. That's just part of being a human. It's also a gigantic liability at key turning points. So I say that massive change is already upon us. When I first gave this material as a talk 3 years ago, I used to say massive change is coming. Well, it's here now. That much is completely obvious. And the belief I hold is that it's really just getting underway. And I'm going to show you why I believe that. Next, I believe that it is possible that the pace and/or scope of change could overwhelm the ability of our key social and support institutions to adapt. Katrina taught us that a major U.S. city could be wiped out and pretty much remain that way for years. That is an example of major change occurring faster than our ability as a nation to respond. The types of changes I foresee in our economic landscape are much larger than Katrina. My third belief is that we do not lack any technology or understanding necessary to build ourselves a better future. Rather, we only lack the political will, which is really a reflection of the fact that we the people have not yet raised our voices in unison for real, substantive change. So the good news is that we already have everything we need, and the bad news is that we might not deploy it fast enough. Remember, these are simply my beliefs right now, and I reserve the right to change them if new information suggests that they are wrong. So what do I mean when I say massive change is upon us? Well, here is where we need to burrow into the 3 E's, which is where we'll spend the rest of our time in the crash course. The first E is the economy, which is the lens through which the crash course looks at everything. Within the economy, there are 4 primary areas of concern: exponential money, the first ever collapse of a global credit binge, an aging population, and a national failure to save. If it isn't clear to you what these mean, don't worry, we'll be discussing each of these in detail. The next E is energy, and there we will discuss what peak oil implies for an economic system that is based on continual expansion. This topic is important enough that I should dedicate the entire crash course to it, but I can't and I won't. And finally, the third E, the environment, will be exerting its own unknowable but certainly significant economic burdens due to shrinking resources and other systemic pressures at the same time that the other 2 E's will be clamoring for your money and attention. The story that I'm going to weave for you cuts across all three E's and will make the claim that our monetary system is badly out of step with reality and will suffer severe instability and possibly collapse as a result. It is fair to say that this particular constellation of issues, problems if you will, has never been faced before at these levels. Never. Whether you find this terrifying or exhilarating is simply a matter of your mindset. One key towards easing your mind is being armed with accurate and detailed information. This is what the crash course will deliver. When viewed individually, each one of these sub-areas on each one of these E's could entirely consume your entire attention. But I'm going to make the claim that these problems are so intertwined that they cannot be solved in isolation. All three E's need to be considered at the same time. How are they linked? By something very powerful that we desperately need to understand a lot better. Please join me for Chapter 3, Exponential Growth. Thank you for listening. In the crash course, we will learn a few foundational key concepts. None are more important than exponential growth. Understanding this will greatly enhance our chances to form a better future. Here's a classic chart displaying exponential growth, a chart pattern that is often called a hockey stick. We are charting an amount of something over time. The only requirement for a graph to end up looking like this is that the thing being measured grows by some percentage over each increment of time. The slower the percentage rate of growth, the greater the length of time we'd need to chart in order to visually see this hockey stick shape. Another thing I want you to take away from this chart is that once an exponential function turns the corner, even though the percentage rate of growth might remain constant and possibly quite low, the amounts do not. They pile up faster and faster. In this particular case, you are looking at a chart of something that historically grew at less than 1% per year. It is world population, and because it is only growing at roughly 1% per year, we need to look at several thousands of years to detect this hockey stick shape. The green is history, and the red is the most recent UN projection of population growth for just the next 42 years. Certainly by now, math-minded folks might be getting a little uncomfortable because they might feel I'm not presenting this information in a classical or even very accurate way. Where mathematicians have been trained to define exponential growth in terms of the rate of change, we are going to focus on the amount of change. Both are valid, it's just that one way is easier to express as a formula, and the other way is easier for most people to intuitively grasp. Unlike the rate of change, the amount of change is not constant. It grows larger and larger with every passing unit of time, and that's why it's more important for us to appreciate than the rate. This is such an important concept that I will dedicate the next chapter to illustrating it. Also, mathematicians would say that there's no turn the corner stage of an exponential chart, because this is just an artifact of where we draw the left-hand scale. That is, an exponential chart can nearly always look like a hockey stick at every moment in time, as long as we adjust the left axis properly. But if we know the limits, or boundaries, of what we are measuring, then we can fix the left axis, and the turn the corner stage is absolutely real and vitally important. For example, the total carrying capacity of the Earth for humans is thought to be somewhere in this zone, give or take a few billion. Because of this, the turn the corner stage is very real and not an artifact of graphical trickery. The critical takeaway for exponential functions, the one thing I want you to recall, relates to the concept of speeding up. You can think of the key feature of exponential growth either as the amount that is added growing larger over each additional unit of time, or you can think of it as the time shrinking between each additional unit of amount added. Either way, the theme is speeding up. To illustrate this using population, if we started with 1 million people and set the growth rate to a measly 1% per year, we'd find that it would take 694 years before we achieved 1 billion people. But we'd be at 2 billion people after only 100 more years, while a third billion would require just 41 more years. Then 29 years, then 22, and then finally only 18 years to add another to bring us to 6 billion people. That is, each additional billion people took a shorter and shorter amount of time to achieve. Here we can see the theme of speeding up. This next chart is of oil consumption, perhaps the most important resource of them all, which has been growing at the much faster rate of nearly 3% per year, so we can detect the hockey stick shape over the course of just 150 years. And here, too, we can fix the left axis with some precision because we know with reasonable accuracy how much oil the world can maximally produce. So again, having turned the corner is an extremely relevant and important event to us. And here's the U.S. money supply, which has been compounding at incredible rates, ranging between 5 and 18% per year. So this chart only needs to be a few decades long to see this hockey stick effect. And here's worldwide water use, species extinction, fisheries exploited, and forest cover lost. Each one of these is a finite resource, as are many other critical resources, and quite a few are approaching their limits. And here is the world you live in. If it seems like the pace of change is speeding up, well, that's because it is. You happen to live at a time when humans will finally have to confront the fact that our exponential money system and resource use will encounter hard physical limits. And behind all of this, driving every bit of every graph, is the number of people on the surface of the planet. Taken one at a time, any one of these charts could command the full attention of every earnest person on the face of the planet. But we need to understand that they are, in fact, all related and interconnected. They are all compound graphs, and they are all being driven by compounding forces. To try and solve one, you'd need to understand how it relates to the other ones that you see, as well as others not displayed here, because they all intersect and overlap. The fact that you live here, in the presence of multiple exponential graphs relating to everything from money to population to species extinction, has powerful implications for your life and the lives of those who will follow you. It deserves your very highest attention. Let's move on to an example that will help you better understand these graphs. Please join me for Chapter 4, Compounding's the Problem. Thank you for listening. The purpose of this mini presentation is to help you understand the power of compounding. If something, such as a population, oil demand, a money supply, anything steadily increases in size as a proportion of its current size, you get a graph that looks like this. A hockey stick. Said more simply, if something is increasing over time on a percentage basis, it's growing exponentially. Using an example drawn from a magnificent paper by Dr. Albert Bartlett, let me illustrate the power of compounding to you. Suppose I had a magic eyedropper and I placed a single drop of water in the middle of your left hand. The magic part is that this drop of water is going to double in size every minute. At first, nothing seems to be happening, but by the end of a minute, that tiny drop is now the size of 2 tiny drops. After another minute, you now have a little pool of water that is slightly smaller in diameter than a dime sitting in your hand. After 6 minutes, you now have a blob of water that would just fill a thimble. Now, suppose we take our magic eyedropper to Fenway Park, and right at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, we place a magic drop way down there on the pitcher's mound. To make this really interesting, suppose that the park is watertight and that you are handcuffed to one of the very highest bleacher seats. My question to you is this: how long do you have to escape from the handcuffs? Days? Weeks? Months? Years? How long would that take? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. The answer is you have until 12:49 on that same day to figure out how you're going to get out of those handcuffs. In less than 50 minutes, our modest little drop of water has managed to completely fill Fenway Park. Now let me ask you this. At what time of the day would Fenway Park still be 93% empty space? And how many of you would realize the severity of your predicament? Any guesses? The answer is 12:44. If you were squirming in your bleacher seat, waiting for help to arrive, by the time the field is covered with less than 5 feet of water, you would now have less than 5 minutes left to get free. And that right there illustrates one of the key features of compound growth. The one thing that I want you to take away from all of this: with exponential functions, the action really only heats up in the last few moments. We sat in our seat for 44 minutes, nothing much seemed to be happening, and then in 5 minutes, bang, the whole place was full. This example is loosely based on a wonderful paper by Dr. Albert Bartlett that clearly and cleanly describes this process of compounding, which you can find in our essential reading section. Dr. Bartlett said, "The greatest shortcoming of the human race is the inability to understand the exponential function." And he's absolutely right. With this understanding, you'll begin to understand the urgency I feel. There's simply not a lot of maneuvering room once you hop on the vertical portion of a compound graph. Time gets short. This makes compounding the first key concept of the crash course. Now, what does all of this have to do with money and the economy and your future? Haha, I can't wait to tell you. Let's go find out. Now I'm going to introduce the second key concept, and it's far enough outside of the mainstream that I'm going to get a little backup from a 19th century philosopher. Here's the quote: "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident." This great quote comes from this happy guy down in the corner. At some point over the next 20 years, this next concept I'm about to introduce will be self-evident. But for now, I think it would be safe to say that a lot of people would consider it to be ridiculous. And it centers around growth. Growth is good, right? We all want a growing economy, I guess. Why? Well, because a growing economy means that we're becoming more prosperous. Growth offers opportunities, and we're all for opportunities. At least I am. And this is the dominant story of our day. So many people would say that growth equals prosperity. But is this actually true? And what if it's not? Growth is actually a consequence of surplus, if we think about it. For example, our bodies only grow if they have a surplus of food. With an exact match between calories consumed and calories burned, a body neither gains nor loses weight. A pond only grows deeper if more water is flowing in than is flowing out, so it can be said that growth is actually dependent on surplus. Similarly, prosperity is dependent on surplus. Here's another example. Imagine that you are a family of four, your yearly income is $40,000, and at the end of the year, there is no money left. At the end of the year, there are $0 extra dollars. But then a 10% raise comes along, which equals $4,000, and your family can either afford to have one more child, or you can enjoy additional prosperity by spending a little bit more on each person. But you can't do both. There is only enough surplus money in this example to do one thing, so you have to choose. Will it be growth, or will it be additional prosperity? And what is true in this example for a family of four is equally true for a town, a state, a country, and yes, our entire world. Through this example, we can tease out a very simple and utterly profound concept, that growth does not equal prosperity. For the past few hundred years, we've been lulled into linking the two concepts because there was always sufficient surplus energy that we could have both growth and prosperity. That is, we didn't have to make any hard choices between the two. The economist Malcolm Slessor of the Resource Use Institute of Edinburgh, Scotland, has calculated that over half of the world's energy is now used to simply grow. So here's the question. What's going to happen when 100% of our surplus money or energy is being used to simply grow? The result is going to be stagnant prosperity. And what happens if there's not enough surplus to even fund growth alone? Well, when that time comes, we will experience both negative growth and negative prosperity. Not exactly the sort of future that I'm looking forward to. This, then, is the greatest challenge of our times, properly recognizing where we want our remaining surplus to go and getting that story out. I, for one, want to see continued advances in energy efficiency and medical technology and everything else that modern society can offer. This is what we place at risk if we allow ourselves to do what is easy, that is, take the path of least resistance and simply grow, instead of doing what is right, which is directing our surplus towards a more prosperous future. So there it is, key concept number 2. Growth does not equal prosperity. Now that you have these two in hand, we're ready to explore this thing called money. Before we begin our tour through the economy, the environment, and energy, we need to share a common understanding of money. Money is something that we live with so intimately on a daily basis that it has probably escaped our close attention. Money is an essential human creation, and were all money to disappear, a new form of money would spontaneously arise in its place, such as, cows, tobacco, bread, a certain type of nut husk perhaps, or even nautilus shells. Without money, the complex job specializations that we have today would not exist because barter is so cumbersome and constraining. More importantly, though, is the concept that each type of money system has its pros and cons. Each will enforce its own peculiar outcomes by promoting some behaviors while suppressing others. Now, if we crack open a textbook, we'll find that money should possess three characteristics. The first is that it should be a store of value. Gold and silver have filled this role perfectly because they were rare, took a lot of human energy to mine, and did not corrode or rust. By contrast, the US dollar pretty much constantly loses value over time, a feature which punishes savers and enforces the need to speculate. A second feature is that money needs to be widely accepted within a population as an intermediary within and across all economic transactions. And the third feature is that money needs to be a unit of account, meaning that the money must be divisible and each unit must be equivalent. The US unit of account is the dollar. Diamonds have much value but are not good at being money because they are not perfectly equivalent to each other, and dividing causes them to lose value. That is, they fail at being a unit of account. Blah, blah, blah. So what is money really? I believe it has a very simple definition. Money is a claim on human labor. With a very few minor exceptions, pretty much anything you can think of that you might spend your money on will involve human labor to bring it there. I say it's a claim on labor rather than a store of labor, because the human labor in question might have happened in the past, or it might not have happened yet. The concept of money being a claim on human labor is important, and we'll be building on it later, especially when we get to debt. As implied in the pictures earlier, literally anything can be considered money. Cows, bread, shells, tobacco. A US dollar, like all modern currencies, however, is an example of a type of money called fiat money. Fiat is a Latin word meaning let it be done. And fiat money has value because a government decrees that it does. And this brings us to the key question. What exactly is a US dollar? Once a dollar was backed by a known weight of silver or gold of intrinsic value. In this example, we can see the dollar came from the US Treasury and was backed by a given amount of silver that was payable to the bearer upon demand. Of course, that was back in the 1930s, and those days are long gone. Now dollars are the liability of an outfit called the Federal Reserve, a private entity entrusted to manage the U.S. money supply and empowered by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to perform this vital function. You'll note that modern dollars have no language entitling the bearer to anything, and that's because they're no longer backed by anything tangible. Rather, the value of a dollar comes from this language right here, the fact that it is illegal to refuse to accept dollars for payment, and that Federal Reserve notes are the only acceptable form of payment for taxes. It is crucially important that a nation's money supply is carefully managed, for if it is not, the monetary unit can be destroyed by inflation. In fact, there are over 3,800 past examples of paper currencies that no longer exist. These are numerous examples from the United States, which may have some collector value, but no longer possess any monetary value. Of course, I could just as easily display beautiful but no longer functional examples from Argentina, Bolivia, and Colombia, and 100 other places. How does the hyperinflationary destruction of a currency happen? Here's a relatively recent example that comes from Yugoslavia between the years 1988 and 1995. Pre-1990, the Yugoslavian dinar, seen here, had measurable value. You could actually buy something with one. However, throughout the 1980s, the Yugoslavian government ran a persistent budget deficit and printed money to make up the shortfall. By the early 1990s, the government had used up all its own hard currency reserves, and they proceeded to loot the private accounts of citizens. In order to keep things moving along, successively larger bills had to be printed, finally culminating in this stunning example, a 500 billion dinar note. At its height, inflation in Yugoslavia was running at over 37% per day. And this meant that prices were doubling every 48 hours or so. Let me see if I can make this a bit more concrete for you. Suppose that on January 1st, 2007, you had a penny, and you could find something to buy with it. At 37% per day inflation, by April 3rd, 2007, you'd need one of these, a $1 billion bill, to purchase the very same item. Stated in reverse, if you had $1 billion on January 1st stuffed in a suitcase, by April 3rd, you'd have had a penny's worth of purchasing power left. Clearly, if you'd attempted to save money during this period of time, you'd have lost it all. So we can safely state that inflationary money regimes impose a penalty on savers. The opposite side of this is that inflationary money regimes promote spending and require that money be invested or even speculated with, so as to at least have the chance of keeping pace with inflation. Of course, investing and speculating involve risks, so we can broaden this statement to include the claim that inflationary money systems require the citizens living within them to subject their hard-earned savings to risk. Now that's worth pondering for a minute or two. Even more importantly, since history shows how common it is for currencies to be mismanaged, we need to keep a careful eye on the stewards of our money to make sure they are not being irresponsible by creating too much money out of thin air, and thereby destroying our savings, our culture, and institutions in the process. Wait a minute. Did I just say creating money out of thin air? Yes. Yes, I did. This is such an important process to your, our, my future that we're going to spend the next two sections learning how money is created. If you're ready, proceed on. If we want to have any hope of understanding all of the things that are going on in the financial world right now, we really have to start with understanding money and how it's created. So here we're going to explore the process by which money is created. Let me introduce you to John Kenneth Galbraith. He taught at Harvard University for many years, and he was active in politics, serving in the administrations of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. He was one of a few two-time recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Clearly a pretty accomplished and stand-up kind of guy. Now, about money, he famously said, the process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled. We're about to discuss that very thing. If you don't get this segment the first pass, don't worry, because money creation is a truly bizarre thing to ponder, let alone accept. It's actually a very simple process, but really difficult to accept. First, let's look at how money is created by banks. Leaving aside for now where this money comes from, suppose a person walks into town with $1,000 and luckily a brand new bank with no deposits has just opened up. The $1,000 is deposited in the bank, and now the person has a $1,000 asset, their bank account, and the bank has a $1,000 liability, the very same bank account. Now, there's a rule on the books, a federal rule, that allows banks to loan out a proportion, a fraction of the money they have on deposit to others. In theory, banks are allowed to loan out up to 90% of what people have on deposit with them, although as we'll see later on, the actual proportion is much closer to 100%. Nonetheless, because banks retain only a fraction of their deposits in reserve, the term for this process is fractional reserve banking. Now back to our example. We now have a bank with $1,000 on deposit, and banks do not make money or make a living by holding on to it. Rather, they make their living by borrowing at one rate and loaning at a higher rate. Since any bank can loan out up to 90% of what they have on deposit, in our example, our bank wants to find somebody who wants to borrow $900. Suppose this borrower then spends that money by giving it to another person, in this case his accountant, who in turn deposits it in a bank. Now, it could be the same bank or a different bank, but that doesn't really change how this story gets told at all. With this new deposit, this same bank now has a fresh $900 to work with, and so it gets busy finding somebody who wants to borrow 90% of that amount, or $810. And so another loan gets made, and it gets spent and redeposited in the bank. And 90% of this new deposit is $729, which can get loaned out. And so it goes until we finally discover that the original $1,000 deposit has mushroomed into a total of $10,000. Is this all real money? Yeah, you bet it is, especially if it's in your bank account. Now, you might also notice here that if everybody who had money at the bank, all $10,000 of them, tried to take their money out at once, the bank would not be able to pay it out because, well, they wouldn't have it. The bank would only have $1,000 hanging around in reserve, period. You might also notice that this mechanism of creating new money out of new deposits works great as long as nobody defaults on their loan. Now, if and when that happens, things get tricky, and that's another story for later. For now, I want you to understand that money is loaned into existence. Conversely, when loans are paid back, money disappears. This is how money is created, and I invite you to verify this for yourself. One place would be the Federal Reserve itself, which has published a handy comic book from which I actually drew this fine example. You can find a link to that on the website under Essential Articles. You may have noticed that I left out something very important here, and that is interest. Where does the money come from to pay the interest on all the loans? If all the loans are paid back without interest, we can undo this entire string of transactions in this example. But when we factor in interest, we'd suddenly discover that there isn't enough money here in this example to pay back all the loans. Clearly, that's a big hole in the story, and so we'll need to find out where that comes from. In doing so, we'll also clear up the mystery of where the original $1,000 came from. So, why did we spend the past 5 minutes studying the mechanism of money creation? Because in order to appreciate the implications of our massive levels of debt, you need to understand how that debt came into being. That's one reason. And the more important reason is tied to all those exponential graphs we viewed earlier in Section 3, but we're not quite there yet. Let's continue. Now we're going to discover where money is created. The process works like this. Suppose Congress needs more money than it has. I know, that's a stretch. Perhaps it's done something really historically foolish, like cutting taxes while conducting 2 wars at the same time. Now, Congress doesn't actually have any money, so the request for additional spending gets passed over to the Treasury Department. You may be surprised, or dismayed, or perhaps neither, to learn that the Treasury Department lives hand to mouth and rarely has more than a couple weeks of cash on hand, if that. So the Treasury Department, in order to raise cash, will print up a stack of Treasury bonds, which are the means by which the U.S. government borrows money. A bond has a face value, which is the amount it will be sold for, and it has a stated rate of interest that it will pay to the holder. So if you bought a bond with $100 face value and that paid a rate of interest of 5%, then you'd pay $100 for this bond, and you'd get $105 back in a year. Treasury bonds are sold regularly in auctions, and it's safe to say that the majority of these bonds are bought by big banks, such as those of China and Japan recently. At auction, the banks purchase these bonds, and then money gets sent into the Treasury coffers, where it can be dispersed for the usual array of government programs. Now, I promised you that I'd show you how money first comes into being, and so far that hasn't happened, has it? The bonds are being bought with money that already exists in the banking system. Money is created by this next mechanism, where the Federal Reserve buys a Treasury bond from a bank. When the Fed does this, they simply transfer money and the amount of the bond to the other bank and take possession of the bond. A bond is swapped for money. Now, where did this money come from? Glad you asked. It comes out of thin air as the Fed creates money when it buys this debt. New Fed money is always exchanged for debt, and so now we can put the title on this page. All dollars are loaned into existence. You don't believe me? Here's a quote from a Federal Reserve publication entitled Putting It Simply. When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. Wow, now that is an extraordinary power. Whereas you or I need to work to obtain money and place it at risk to have it grow, the Federal Reserve simply prints up as much as it wishes whenever it wants, and then loans it to us all via the U.S. government, with interest. Given the fact that over 3,800 paper currencies and a few metallic ones have been rendered worthless due to mismanagement, wouldn't it make sense to keep a very close eye on whether or not the Federal Reserve is acting responsibly? So now we know that there are 2 kinds of money out there. The first is bank credit, which is money that is loaned into existence, as we saw here. Bank credit is a type of money that comes with an equal and offsetting amount of debt associated with it, debt upon which interest must be paid. And the second type of money is printed out of thin air, and that's what you see right here at this stage. The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled. So don't worry if you need to review this chapter several more times. However, if you understood all that and get it, well, congratulations, give yourself a hand, because it's not easy. These monetary learnings allow us to formulate 2 more extremely important key concepts. The first is that all dollars are backed by debt. At the local bank level, all new money is loaned into existence. At the Federal Reserve level, money is simply manufactured out of thin air and then exchanged for interest-paying government debt. In both cases, the money is backed by debt, debt that pays interest. From this key concept, we can formulate a truly profound statement, which is that, at a minimum, each year, enough new money must be loaned into existence to cover the interest payments on all of the past outstanding debt. If we flip this slightly, we can say that each year, all the outstanding debt must compound by at least the rate of interest on that debt. Each and every year, it must grow by some percentage. Because our debt-based money system is growing by some percentage continually, it is an exponential system by its very design. A corollary of this is that the amount of debt in the system will always exceed the amount of money in the system. I'm not going to cast judgment on this and say that it's good or bad. It simply is what it is. By understanding its design, though, you will be better equipped to understand that the potential range of future outcomes for our economy are not limitless, but rather bounded by the rules of the system, all of which leads us to the fourth key concept, which is that perpetual expansion is a requirement of modern banking. In fact, we can make a rule. Each year, new credit or loans must be made that at least equal the amount of all the outstanding interest payments that year. Without a continuous expansion of the money supply, past debts would not be able to be serviced and defaults would ripple through and possibly destroy the system. Defaults are the Achilles heel of a debt-based money system, which we saw in our local banking example in the previous chapter. Because of this, all the institutional and political forces in our society are geared towards avoiding this outcome. So the banking system must continually expand, not necessarily because it's the right or wrong thing to do, but rather simply because that is how it was designed. It's a feature of the system, just like using gasoline is a feature of my car's engine. I might wish and hope that my car would run on straw, but I'd be wasting my time because that's just not how it was designed. By understanding the requirement for continual expansion, we will be in a better position to make informed decisions about what's likely to transpire and take meaningful actions to enhance our prospects. So the key question is this: what happens when a human-contrived money system that must expand by its very design runs headlong into the physical limits of a spherical planet? One more belief of mine is that I will witness this collision in my adult lifetime, and in fact it may have already started, and I am extremely interested to see how this is all going to turn out. Now, this is admittedly a truly gigantic proposition to consider, and some would say that it's not very interesting at all, but rather it's just frightening. Well, if you want the future to look exactly like the past, then I suppose it is frightening. But if you are flexible in your view of the future, then you have an opportunity to make the most of whatever future actually arrives. These are fascinating, invigorating, and truly unprecedented times, and I am thrilled to be living right here, right now, with you. In the next section, we'll be looking at some very important historical context about our money system, where you'll learn that our money system could be viewed as a masterpiece of sophisticated evolution, or as an historically brief experiment that is not yet 37 years old. Let's go. Before we move on to current events, it's vital to know how we got here. I will now present an extremely shortened version of recent U.S. monetary history. The purpose of this section is to show you that the U.S. government has radically shifted the rules during times of emergency, and that our monetary system is really a lot younger than you might think. After the panic of 1907, when private banker J.P. Morgan intervened as the lender of last resort, banks began agitating for a government solution. What was finally decided upon in 1913 was a federally sponsored cartel called the Federal Reserve, which sounded governmental, but really was not. The stock of the Federal Reserve was to be held by its member banks, not the U.S. government, nor the public, which remains the case today. So what we call the Federal Reserve actually is a federally sponsored banking cartel, licensed to lend money into existence. By the 1930s, a federally reserve-fueled speculative bubble had burst, resulting in numerous bank failures, which shrank the money supply by nearly a third in 3 years. Despite being chartered as a lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve failed to halt a catastrophic banking collapse. In 1933, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to counter the falling money supply in a most drastic manner. To accomplish this, he confiscated all privately held gold and immediately devalued the U.S. dollar. Prior to the seizure, it took approximately $21 to buy an ounce of gold, and afterwards, it took $35. Soon after, contractual obligations of the U.S. government, such as bonds payable in gold, were nullified with the approval of the Supreme Court. This goes to show how governments in a period of emergency can change rules and break their own laws. All of the seized gold either ended up in the vaults of the Federal Reserve or at the International Monetary Fund or on the books of the Federal Reserve. A grand total of $11 billion was exchanged for all 261 million ounces of the nation's gold. In other words, complete control of the gold supply of the most powerful and prosperous nation on earth was exchanged for $11 billion printed out of thin air, creating some very serious storage hardships for the Federal Reserve. I mean, have you ever tried lifting 70-pound gold bricks that high over your head? In any event, to end the turmoil of depression and war and to provide a foundation for global recovery, a conference was held at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, with all the major Allied powers attending. Recognizing that the U.S. then represented nearly half of the global economy, the US dollar was made the global reserve currency. All other currencies had fixed rates of exchange to the dollar, which in turn was redeemable for gold at $35 per ounce. The Bretton Woods II system ushered in a period of prosperity and rapid economic recovery. But there was a flaw in the system. Nothing in the Bretton Woods Agreement prevented the U.S. Federal Reserve from expanding the supply of Federal Reserve notes. As this happened, the gold backing behind each dollar steadily declined, such that there was not enough gold to back all of the dollars. Meanwhile, as the Vietnam War intensified, the U.S. was running budget deficits and flooding the world with paper dollars. The French, under President Charles de Gaulle, became suspicious that the U.S. would be unable to honor its Bretton Woods obligations to redeem their excess dollars into gold. As the French exchanged their surplus dollars for gold, the U.S. Treasury's gold stocks declined alarmingly. Finally, President Nixon declared force majeure on August 15, 1971, and slammed the gold window, ending its dollar convertibility. That's what governments do during wartime, and the U.S. followed the pattern perfectly. But this time, it affected the whole world because the removal of gold convertibility of the dollar destroyed the foundation of the Bretton Woods system. Without a gold backing, there was no hard physical limit to how many paper dollars could be issued. Since we now know that all dollars are backed by debt, what do you suppose happened to U.S. debt levels once the externally applied rigor of gold was removed? Let's find out. This is a chart of U.S. federal debt from the period of 1949 to 2004. Note that it looks like any other exponential chart we've already reviewed, but especially note that the graph turns the corner shortly after Nixon slammed the gold window. That is, when Nixon removed the last vestige of external physical restraint from the system. And also note how rapidly the debt levels have climbed recently. These past few years have seen the highest and most rapid accumulation of federal debt in our entire history, thanks in large measure to an experiment never before attempted in our country's history: the conduct of 2 foreign wars and a tax cut at the same time. This rapid accumulation of debt is not a mysterious process at all. Rather, it's an entirely predictable consequence of the slamming of the gold window. How much longer can this continue? Unfortunately, there's no good answer to this besides, as long as foreigners let us. A second predictable and related consequence concerns the total amount of money in circulation. Remember, all money is loaned into existence, so the shape of the federal debt chart should tip you off to the shape of this next chart of U.S. money from the years 1959 to 2007. The first thing we can note here is that it took our country over 300 years, from the very first pilgrim until 1973, to generate our first $1 trillion of money stock. Every road, every bridge, every marketplace on every corner of every town, every boat, and every building, from the first colony until 1973, required $1 trillion of money stock. Our most recent $1 trillion? That was created in the last 4.5 months. My questions to you are these. What will it be like to live here when our nation is creating $1 trillion every 4 weeks? How about every 4 days? What about every 4 hours? 4 minutes? Where does this stop if not in hyperinflation and the destruction of the dollar, and by extension, our nation? If we view these events on a timeline, we can see that the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913, and that only 20 years later, in 1933, our country had entered a form of bankruptcy and had turned over its collective gold supply under force of law to the Federal Reserve. 11 years after that, the US dollar was enshrined as the world's reserve currency with an explicit backing by gold. That was unilaterally removed by Nixon 27 years later. In effect, the current global monetary system of unbacked currencies is now only 37 years old. It was not planned, but simply emerged out of a crisis. The unredeemable US dollar remains a popular reserve currency as a matter of convenience, but nothing requires or guarantees that it will retain this role. Only the US is able to use its eroding reserve currency status to borrow and print dollars to pay for its trade deficits. However, as the dollar loses its reserve currency status from this abuse, the US will be forced to either export more to pay for its imports, or to take on ever heavier levels of debt. If these actions cause the dollar to keep falling, other countries will be tempted to devalue their currencies to keep pace and remain competitive. The potential for an inflationary period is evident, which brings us to the next section. We've got one more key concept in front of us, and that's inflation. and then we're going to connect a few dots at the end. Most of us think of inflation as rising prices, but that's not quite right. Imagine if an apple and an orange are $1 each one year, but $10 each next year. Since you enjoy eating apples and oranges the same in one year as the next, then the only thing that's truly changed here is your money, which has declined in value. Inflation is not caused by rising prices. Rising prices are instead a symptom of inflation. Inflation is caused by the presence of too much money in relation to goods and services. What we experience are things going up in price, but in fact inflation is really the value of your money going down, simply because there's too much of it around. Here's an example. Suppose you're on a life raft and somebody has an orange that they are willing to sell for money. Only one person in the raft has any money, and that's a single dollar. So the orange sells for $1. But wait, just before it sells, you find a $10 bill in your pocket. Now, how much do you suppose the orange sells for? That's right, $10. It's still the same orange, right? Nothing about the utility or desirability of the orange has changed from one minute to the next. Only the amount of money kicking around in the raft. So we can make this claim. Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And what's true within a tiny life raft is equally true across an entire nation. Here, let me illustrate this point by using a long sweep of U.S. history. What we're looking at here is a graph of price levels in the United States that begins on the left in 1665 and progresses more than 300 years to 2008 on the right. But at this moment, only inflation over the period from 1665 to 1776 is marked on this chart. On the y-axis, what is being charted are price levels, not the rate of inflation. Now you might ask, how can we compare prices in 1665 to 2008? While there are some obvious liberties that have to be taken here, what is being compared are the basics of life. People ate food in 1665, just as they did later on. People had to transport themselves. They got educations, and they lived in houses in 1665, just as they did in 1776. So what is being compared is the relative cost of living in one period to the next. That is, inflation. In 1665, the basic cost of living was set to a value of 5. Now what is most striking about this chart to me is that from 1665 to 1776, there was absolutely no inflation. For 111 years, $1 saved was, well, $1 saved. Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a world where you could earn $1,000, put it in a coffee can in the backyard, and your great-great-grandchildren could dig it up and enjoy the same benefits from that $1,000 as you would have 111 years previously? This isn't some fantasy from a cheap novella. This was reality in our country at one time. The country was on a gold and silver standard during this period and advanced tremendously while enjoying near-perfect price stability during times of peace. However, along comes a war, the Revolutionary War, and the country found itself unable to pay for the war with the gold and silver in the treasury, so a paper currency called Continentals was printed, and at first it was fully backed by a specified amount of real gold and silver in the treasury. But then the war proved to be more expensive than thought, and more of these were printed. Then the British, aware of the corrosive effects of inflation on society, started counterfeiting and distributing vast amounts of bogus Continentals, and soon the currency began to collapse. Before long, massive inflation took hold. Seen on the inflation chart, the Revolutionary War took the general price level from a reading of 5 to a reading of 8. After the war, the paper Continentals were utterly rejected by the people, who strongly preferred gold and silver. Most interestingly, price levels promptly returned back to their pre-war levels. The next serious bout of inflation was also associated with a war, again due to the overprinting of paper currency, and again, upon conclusion of the war, we saw a relatively prompt return of prices to their pre-war levels, where they stayed for an additional 30 years. By now, we are nearly 200 years into this chart, and we find that the cost of living is roughly the same as it was in 1665. But then a war came along, the Civil War this time, and it was a doozy. To finance the war, the North had to resort to printing a type of currency that still lends its name to our own currency today. Of course, back then, it really did have a green back. Again, we see a rapid rise of inflation as a direct consequence of war, and again, a return to baseline after the crisis is over. We are now 250 years into this story, and the cost of living is still roughly the same as it was at the start. I invite you to think about that for a minute. But then another war came along, and this one was even bigger than any before, and again it was a highly inflationary event. And then another war, even bigger than any before it, which again proved inflationary, but this time, something odd happened. Inflation did not retreat before the next war began. Why? Two reasons. First, the country was no longer on a gold standard, but instead a fiat paper standard, administered by the Federal Reserve, and the populace did not have another form of currency to which it could turn. And second, because this was the first time that the war apparatus was not dismantled upon conclusion of hostilities. Instead, full mobilization was maintained and a protracted Cold War was fought, certainly as inflationary a conflict as any shooting war ever was. And now, if we look at the entire sweep of history, we can make an utterly obvious conclusion. All wars are inflationary. Why is this? Because any time the government engages in deficit spending, it creates the conditions for inflation. However, when the deficit spending is on legitimate infrastructure, such as roads or bridges or schools, that investment will slowly pay for itself by boosting productivity and paving the way for the creation of additional goods and services that will someday soak up the extra cash. Wars, however, are special. Vast quantities of money are spent on things that are meant to be blown up. The money stays at home while the goods get sent off to be blown up. When a bomb blows up, there's no residual benefit to the domestic economy later on. This means war spending is the most inflationary of all spending. It's a double whammy. The money stays behind working its evil magic, while the goods it produced are destroyed. Heck, even if the goods aren't blown up, there's practically zero residual economic benefit to such specialized hardware, as amazing as that technology may be. For some reason, the most recent pair of wars have been presented by the U.S. mainstream press as being relatively pain-free for the average citizen, despite overwhelming historical odds to the contrary. In fact, on this 15-year-long chart of commodity prices, we observe that prices bounced in a channel, marked by the green lines, for more than 10 years. However, and hopefully by now unsurprisingly, shortly after the start of the Iraq War, commodity prices began marching higher and have inflated nearly 140% in 5 years. Your gasoline and food bills will confirm this. So if anybody tries to tell you that you haven't sacrificed for the war, let them know you sacrificed a large portion of your savings and your paycheck to the effort. Thank you very much. At any rate, back to our main story. Here's inflation between 1665 and 1975. Knowing what you now know about Nixon's actions on August 15, 1971, what do you suppose the rest of the graph looks like between 1975 and today? This is your world. You've been living on the steeply rising portion of this graph for so long that it probably looks like level ground to you. Because inflation is now a permanent feature, and because it advances at a percentage rate, your money is declining in value exponentially. That's what this hockey stick graph is telling you. What does it mean to live in a world where your money loses value exponentially? You know what it means, because you live there. It means always having to work harder and harder just to stay in place. And it means perplexing and astoundingly risky investment decisions have to be made in an attempt to grow one's savings fast enough to avoid the ravages of inflation. It means two incomes are needed where one used to suffice, and kids left at home while both parents work. A world of constantly eroding money is a devilishly complicated world to navigate and leaves scant room for error, especially for those without the appropriate means or connections. And it doesn't have to be this way, and indeed for the majority of our country's history, as you can see, it wasn't. And I'm hard-pressed to say that inflation is a necessity and serves some essential and greater good because a lot of progress and advancement happened between 1665 and 1940 without the benefit of perpetual inflation. To help put all of this in context, let's mark the moments when our country abandoned the gold standard, first internally and then completely. It may have surprised some of you, as it did me, to find out that inflation is not a mysterious law of nature like gravity, but rather an extremely well-characterized matter of policy. So now we have our fifth key concept. Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. Flipped a bit, we can say that inflation is a deliberate act of policy. Here's what one wag had to say about this matter. Paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value. Zero. That was Voltaire in 1729. Of course, he was a bit too pessimistic in his assessment, as this German woman proves by using her furnace to liberate the intrinsic heat content of paper money. John Maynard Keynes, the father of the branch of economics that utterly dominates our lives, had this to say about inflation. Lenin was certainly right. There is no more positive or subtle or surer means of destroying the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of the citizens. The process engages all of the hidden forces of economics on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner that not one man in a million can diagnose. Given that the destructive, corrosive effects of inflation are so well understood by the architects and the administrators of our monetary system, it's fair to wonder exactly what the plan here is. Now, finally, here in Chapter 10 of the Crash Course, we can string together these three very important dots. Number one, in 1971, the U.S., and by extension the world, terminated the last connection to a gold restraint, and federal borrowing turned the corner, never to look back. Concurrently, the money supply turned the corner, piling up at a much faster rate than the growth of goods and services. And so we get to data point number 3, which is that inflation is the fully predictable outcome of data points 1 and 2. Boom, boom, boom. 1, 2, 3. All connected, all saying the same thing, with profound implications for your future. Now, if you're of a mind that there's no reason that all three of these graphs cannot just continue to exponentially accelerate to ever higher amounts without end, then there's no point in watching the rest of the crash course. However, if you don't happen to believe that, then you're going to want to see the rest of this. There is literally nothing more important for you to be doing right now than gaining an understanding of how these pieces fit together, assessing the risks for yourself, and taking actions to prepare for the possibility of a future that's substantially different from today. Now that we've covered compounding, money, and inflation, you have the tools to get the most from the remaining sections of the crash course. We have a few more dots to connect. Let's go. During the crash course, you will often encounter numbers that are expressed in trillions. How much is a trillion? You know what? I'm not really sure myself. A trillion is a very big number, and I think it would be worth spending a couple of minutes trying to get our arms around the concept. First, a numerical review. 1,000 is a 1 with 3 zeros after it. A million is 1,000 times bigger than that, and it's a 1 with 6 zeros after it. At this level, I can still get my mind around the difference between these two numbers. $1 million in the bank is a very different concept from $1,000 in the bank, and I can really get that. A billion, then, is 1,000 times bigger than a million, and it's a 1 followed by 9 zeros. And a trillion is 1,000 times bigger than that, and it's a 1 followed by 12 zeros. So a trillion is 1,000 billions, which means it's a million millions. You know what? I don't know what that means. I can't visualize that. So let's take a different tack on this. Suppose I gave you a $1,000 bill and said you and a friend had to spend it all in a single evening out in the town. You'd have a pretty good time. Now suppose you had a stack of $1,000 bills that was 4 inches in height. If you did, you know what? Congratulations, you are a millionaire. A stack of $1,000 bills 4 inches high, and you are a millionaire. Now suppose you wanted to enter the super elite of the wealthy and have $1 billion. How tall of a stack of $1,000 bills would that be? The answer is a stack only 358 feet high, seen here barely reaching a third of the way up the Petronas Towers. Now how about a stack of $1,000 bills to equal $1 trillion? How tall would that stack be? Think of an answer. Well, that stack would be 67.9 miles high. And I meant stack, too, not laid end to end or anything cheesy like that. A solid stack of $1,000 bills, 67.9 miles high. Now that's $1 trillion. That still doesn't do it for you? Okay, I want you to imagine then that you're in a car on a roadway that's lined at the side with a sideways stack of $1,000 bills. A nice, compact, rectangular column of $1,000 bills is snaking along the roadside next to you as you drive, the whole way. And you drive along, brrrr, without stopping, for a little more than an hour, and the entire way, there's that stack of $1,000 bills right next to you on the side of the road the whole way. Said another way, the amount of money created in the past 4.5 months in our economic system, if it had been printed up as $1,000 bills and stacked along the side of the road, would stretch from Springfield, Mass. To Albany, New York. So there it is. Either you can visualize the stack better by driving along next to it, or by standing on top of it, or any other way you wish, as long as you can find a way to express this statement in a way that's meaningful for you. But make no mistake, a trillion is a very, very big number. And we should not be lulled into complacency simply because it's too big to really get our minds around. That should drive us to action instead. Keep this lesson in mind as we discuss the total accumulated debts and liabilities of the United States, which are now many trillions of dollars. Now we enter part 2 of the crash course. Here you'll see the very information that led me and my family to make profound changes in our lives. Where we live, my line of work, even where we get our food. With the background you've received to this point, you are now positioned to understand how the 3 E's, the economy, energy, and the environment, intersect and seemingly converge on a very narrow window of the future, what I am calling the 20 teens. It's the data in these next parts that leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. A small warning, this material can be shocking. And so we begin part 2 with debt. We're going to pick up 2 more key concepts in this section, and one of them is utterly essential, and it's this. Ever-growing debts implicitly assume that the future will be larger than the present. We'll be examining this statement in detail in this chapter. Before we go there, a few definitions are in order. A financial debt is a contractual obligation to repay a specified amount of money at some point in the future. The concept of debt is thoroughly characterized within the legal system so that we can say that a debt is a legal contract providing money today in exchange for repayment in the future. With interest, of course. Debts come in many forms. Auto loans and mortgage debt are known as secured debts because there's a recoverable asset attached to the debt. Credit card debt is known as unsecured because no specific asset can be directly seized in the event of a default. For you and I, there are only 2 ways to settle a debt: pay it off or default on it. If you have a printing press like the government does, a third option exists: printing money to pay for the debt. This method is a poorly disguised form of taxation since it forcefully removes value from all existing money and transfers that value to the debt holders. I view it as a form of default, but one that preferentially punishes savers and those least able to bear the impact of inflation. The pure debt obligations of the U.S. government as of April 2008 stand at $9,444 billion and change. This is only the debt. Once we add in the liabilities of the U.S. government, chiefly Medicare and Social Security, we get a number 5 to 8 times larger than this. We'll be discussing these liabilities in the next chapter, so that's all I'm going to say about them right now. Right now, we are focused simply on debt, and it's enough to know that debt is only part of the whole story. Next, this is a chart of total U.S. debt. That's federal, state, municipal, corporate, and private debts in the red line, compared against total national income in the yellow line. The total debt in the United States now stands at over $48 trillion. That's 48 stacks of $1,000 bills, each of which is 67.9 miles high. If we adjust these debt levels for both population and inflation over time, so that we're comparing apples to apples, we find that in 1952 there was the equivalent of $76,000 in total debt per person, and that today the number is $183,000. At $183,000 per head, this means that today, the average family of 4 in America is associated with $732,000 of debt. This is a useful way to look at debt because it doesn't really matter if the debt is owed by a government agency or a corporation or an individual, because these are really the debts of our country, and all debts get paid through the actions of people. So examining the debts on a per capita or a household basis gives us a sense of the situation. Can debts forever grow faster than the incomes that service them? No, they cannot. There's a mathematical limit in there somewhere. Am I saying that all debt is bad? No, I'm not. Time for another definition. Debt that can best be described as investment debt provides the opportunity to pay itself back. An example would be a college loan offering the opportunity to earn a higher wage in the future. Another would be a loan to expand the seating at a successful restaurant. In the parlance of bankers, these are examples of self-liquidating debt, meaning that the loans boost future revenues and have a means of paying themselves back. But what about loans that are merely consumptive in nature, such as those taken out for a fancier car or for vacations or for more war materiel? These are called non-self-liquidating debts because they do not generate any additional future revenue. So not all debts are bad. Only too much unproductive borrowing is bad. In the past 5 years, American debt has grown by more than $16 trillion, and a very large proportion of that has been the non-self-liquidating variety. This has profound implications for the future, because non-self-liquidating loans do not generate future cash flows. It means that ordinary income will have to be used to pay off today's consumption. And this will mean less cash for discretionary spending in the future. So what is debt really? Well, debt provides us money to spend today. Perhaps we buy a car, and we enjoy that car today. But in the future, loan payments represent money that we do not have then to spend on other items. So we can say that debt represents future consumption taken today. Now, as long as it's my decision to go into debt and the repayments are solely my responsibility, then everything's cool. However, once we consider that our current levels of debt will require the effort of future generations to pay them back, we start to trend into the moral aspect of this story. Is it really proper for one generation to consume well beyond its means and expect the following generations to forego their consumption to pay it all back? That is precisely our current situation, and these charts say as much. I often wonder if my children are going to accept this bargain. I have my doubts. Now, we learned in Section 4 that money can be viewed as a claim on human labor. And we just learned that debt is really just a claim on future money. So we can put these two statements together and arrive at key concept number 6. Debt is a claim on future human labor. When we get to the section on baby boomers and the demographic challenge facing our country, I'll be recalling this very important concept. When viewed historically and compared to gross domestic product, the current levels of debt are completely without precedent. This chart even suggests that our recent lives have been entirely spent in the largest credit bubble in history. Current total credit market debt stands now at more than 340% of total gross domestic product. As we can see on this chart, the last time debts even got remotely close to current levels was back in the 1930s, and that bears a bit of explanation. The easy credit policies of the Fed gave us the roaring 20s, and then a burst credit bubble, which was followed by 11 years of economic contraction and hardship, which we now refer to as the Great Depression. Note that the debt to GDP ratio didn't start to climb until after 1929. What's the explanation for this? Were more loans being made? No. The chart climbs here because while the debts remained fixed, it was the economy that fell away from under them, creating this spike. In the absence of the Great Depression anomaly, our country always held less than 200% of our GDP in debt. And it's only since the mid-1980s that that relationship was violated. So we can say that our current experiment with these levels of debt is only 23 years old, and therefore an historically brief phenomenon. And so it is this chart, more than any other, that leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. I just cannot see how we can pull off another 20 years just like that area circled in red. Based on the shape of this chart, our entire financial universe has made a rather substantial and collective assumption about the future. Because a debt is a claim on the future, each incremental expansion of the level of debt is an implicit assumption that the future will be larger than today. Which means there's a very profound assumption baked right into this debt chart, and that is, the future will be larger than the present. Here's what I mean. A debt is always paid off in the future, and loans are made with the expectation that they'll be paid back, with interest. If more credits are extended this year than last, then that means there's an expectation, an assumption, that the ability exists to pay those loans back in the future. Given that our debts are now over 340% of GDP, there's an explicit assumption here that the future GDP is going to be larger than today's. A lot larger. More cars sold, more resources consumed, more money earned, more houses built, all of it must be larger than today, just to offer the chance of paying back the loans we've already taken on. But each quarter, we see that new debts are being made at a rate 5 to 6 times faster than the growth in the underlying economy. Even with a fairly optimistic assessment of future growth, this trajectory is clearly unsustainable. Our banks, our pension funds, governmental structure, and everything else tied to the continued expansion of debt has an enormous stake in its perpetual growth. And so here we come to our seventh key concept of the crash course. Our debt markets assume that the future will be much larger than the present. But what happens if that's not true? What if the means to repay all those claims does not arrive in the future? Well, broadly speaking, if that comes to pass, there's only one result with two different means of making it happen. The result is that the claims, the debts, must be diminished somehow, and that could happen either by a process of debt defaults or by inflation. The defaults are easy to explain. The debts don't get repaid and the holders of that debt don't get their money back. Boom, the claims get diminished. In this instance, if the future isn't large enough to pay back the claims, then defaults are simply a way of not paying them back. The inflation route can be confusing, so think of it this way. What if you sold your house to someone and elected to hold a note for $500,000? The terms call for the note to be repaid all at once in 10 years as a single payment of $650,000. Well, what if you get paid your $650,000 right on time? But that $650,000 will only buy this house. You got paid all right, but your claim on the future was vastly diminished by inflation. In the default scenario, your money is still worth something, but you don't get it back. In the inflation scenario, you get it back, but it hardly buys anything. In both cases, your future was diminished, so the impact is very nearly the same, but the means of achieving it are wildly different. So the questions you need to ponder for yourself are, have too many claims been made on the future? And if so, will we face inflation or defaults as the means of squaring things up? You will arrive at wildly different life decisions depending on whether you answer yes or no to the first question, and inflation or defaults to the second question. So they are worth pondering. All right, here's what we learned. Key concept number 6. Debt is a claim on future human labor. Second, per capita debt has never been higher. We are in truly unprecedented territory in this country. Debt has increased by $16 trillion in the past 5 years, and most of it consumptive debt. This means that future consumption will have to be seriously curtailed or will enter a period of debt destruction, either by defaults or inflation. And finally, key concept number 7. Our debt markets assume that the future will be much larger than the present. Our entire economic system, and by extension our way of life, is founded on debt. And debt is founded on the assumption that the future will always be bigger than the past. Therefore, it is utterly vital that we examine this assumption closely, because if this assumption is false, so are a lot of other things we may be taking for granted. Whew. All right, we are done. I'll see you next time. If you've just seen the previous chapter on debt, then you might be wondering if either our savings or our assets are of sufficient quantity to make those levels of debt perfectly manageable. In the next chapter, I'll deal with assets. In this chapter, I will present evidence that the United States has failed to save money at virtually every level of society, and make the claim that the United States government is insolvent. I use that term precisely. Whereas bankruptcy is a legal process that begins once cash flows can no longer meet current obligations, insolvency happens when one's liabilities exceed one's assets and is the first step on the road towards bankruptcy. The purpose of the crash course is to give you the context and the data you need to be able to accurately assess the likelihoods and risks that our economy faces over the next few years. My position is that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. And to support this statement, I'm going to take you through 6 key areas of data: debt, savings, assets, demographics, peak oil, and climate change. Any one of these could prove economically challenging, but the combination of 2 or more simultaneously, well, I'll leave that for you to assess. This is a chart of the personal savings rate stretching back to 1959. The personal savings rate is the difference between income and expenditures for all U.S. citizens, expressed as a percentage. So a number like 10% indicates that for every dollar earned, 10 cents was saved, not spent. Note that the long-term historical average for U.S. citizens between 1959 and 1985 was 9.2%. For comparison, in Europe, that number is around 10%, and in China, a stunning 30% of income is saved. Savings are important to us individually because they form the cash cushion that gets us through economic difficulties, and at the national level because savings are essential to the formation of investment capital. That is, the property, plant, and equipment that create actual future wealth. You may have read or heard recently that the personal savings rate has plunged to historic lows, last associated with the Great Depression. In fact, the personal savings rate has steadily declined from 1985 to present, indicating that those headlines we just saw were not some very recent blip on the radar, but rather the culmination of a 23-year erosion of savings as a cultural attribute of U.S. citizens. However, we are not a nation of averages, and this chart somewhat obscures the fact that the extremely wealthy are saving incredible amounts of money, while at the lower ends, the savings rate is deeply negative. Why is that important? Because as the Greek philosopher Plutarch once stated, an imbalance between the rich and the poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. What else can we note about this chart? For starters, a persistently declining savings rate tells us that there is an implicit assumption by the majority that credit will be available in the future. As we look at this chart, we might also note that the savings rate began its decline right around 1985. Wait a minute. Didn't we see that same time frame in the last section on debt? Why, yes, we did. While this chart is showing all debt across all sectors, and the prior chart was of personal savings only, we can note that our national tolerance of debt shifted drastically upwards beginning in 1985, right as our national approach to savings was beginning its long decline towards zero. In order to believe that the future is going to be bigger, shinier, and brighter than the present, you have to believe that low savings and high debts are a path to prosperity. I am skeptical, to say the least, because this just doesn't make sense to me. It violates several laws of nature. Another category of savings is pensions and retirement funds. At the state and municipal levels, we can observe that they too have failed to save, and state and municipal pensions are underfunded to the tune of $1 trillion. What this means is that as money was taken in from taxes, states and municipalities actively chose to spend that money elsewhere, in preference to putting it into pension funds. The idea there, we can guess, was to spend money today and let someone else figure out how to pay for it in the future. Well, for many states, the future has finally arrived. What does it mean when we say that the state and municipal pensions are underfunded by $1 trillion? How is that calculated? The $1 trillion shortfall is what is called a net present value, or NPV amount. A net present value calculation adds up all the cash inflows, in this hypothetical example, $1,000 per year for 6 years, and offsets those cash flows, or nets them against all future cash outflows. Since $1 today is worth more than $1 in the future, however, the future cash flows have to be discounted and brought back to the present. We net all the cash inflows and costs, we discount them back to the present to determine if the thing we are measuring has a positive or negative value. Net present value. This is the methodology used to calculate the status of state and municipal pension funds. Growth in the value of the pension fund assets, plus future taxes, are offset against cash outlays to pensioners and brought back to the present to indicate that in order for the pension funds to simply have a zero value, $1 trillion would, today, have to be placed into those funds. An important realization about NPV calculations is that the future has already been largely taken into account, so waiting and hoping for a different future result to emerge pretty much never works. If we have to place $1 trillion in the funds today, but don't do this, next year the number will only be larger. The only way it could be smaller is if fewer people are collecting benefits, or the fund's assets outperform the assumed rate of growth that fed the NPV calculation. Moving right along, corporations are coming off the highest levels of profitability in decades, but they too opted to underfund their pensions to the tune of $1.5 trillion net present value dollars, in preference for other uses for that cash. Because pensions typically invest in bonds and stocks, in a roughly 60-40 split, Any recessions or market declines will only add to the shortfall. In part, the pension shortfalls are a direct function of the extremely low interest rates currently available. Thanks, Greenspan and Bernanke. And also because the main stock market index is pretty much at the same level it was 9 years ago. And that's only if we don't inflation adjust the results. If we did, we'd have to go back a bit further. Since most pension funds assume an 8 to 10% yearly return, and since the stock market has had a zero gain for 9 years, the pension shortfalls are perfectly understandable. But when we get to the federal government, that's when the scary numbers emerge. David Walker, the recently retired comptroller of the U.S. and a personal hero of mine, said of the U.S. government, "Its financial position is worse than advertised. It has a broken business model. It faces deficits in its budget, its balance of payments, its savings, and its leadership." Wow, those are some pretty strong words. In my assessment, he's absolutely right. And here's some data to support that. This is a table taken right from the U.S. government annual report found on the Treasury Department website. Again, we are going to be looking at NPV numbers. The first is a nearly $9 trillion shortfall representing the total U.S. government net position, without including Social Security and Medicare. Again, this means that all U.S. government cash inflows, plus the value of all government assets, would have to be offset against known outlays to determine that, today, the U.S. government would have to somehow obtain $8.9 trillion to balance its liabilities against its assets. But that's not even the 1/5 of it. Once we add in Social Security and Medicare, the shortfall suddenly balloons to $53 trillion by the Treasury Department's own calculations. Whoa, stop right there. That's more than 4 times GDP. This means that the U.S. government is insolvent. Why is this not topic number 1 on the presidential campaign trail? A country this far in hock has some real future issues and is potentially on its way to bankruptcy. In case you are harboring the notion that there's some money socked away in a special U.S. government account, like a lockbox, this picture shows George Bush standing next to the entire Social Security Trust Fund. Yep, there it is. The entire trust fund is a 3-ring binder with slips of paper in it saying that the U.S. government has spent all the money and replaced it with special treasury bonds. Hold on there. Aren't treasury bonds an obligation of the U.S. government? How can the government owe itself money? It can't. All government revenue either comes from taxpayers or borrowing. So when the time comes to pay off those special bonds, that money will either come from taxpayers or additional borrowing. If it were possible to owe money to yourself and pay interest to boot, then we could all become fabulously wealthy by writing ourselves checks. But, of course, this is a foolish, easily dispelled notion. At any rate, depending on which government agency's numbers you use, the federal shortfall is anywhere from $53 trillion to $85 trillion. This number is so large that it even scares small monkeys. And proving the point that you cannot grow your way out of an NPV shortfall, this number has grown by nearly $40 trillion over the past 10 years, advancing during both strong and weak economic times. And finally, saving is related to investing. And according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we've fallen short there as well. In 2005, they assessed the condition of 12 categories of infrastructure, including bridges, roadways, drinking water systems, and wastewater treatment plants. They gave the U.S. an overall grade of D and calculated that $1.6 trillion would be needed over the next 5 years to bring us back up to first world standards. Since that was in 2005, and inflation for things made out of metal and asphalt has advanced enormously since then, let's just round that up to, say, an even $2 trillion. Putting it all together, we find that a personal failure to save is reflected by a state and local failure to save, which are themselves mirrored by a corporate failure to save, all dwarfed by a failure to save at the federal government level. And capping it all off is a profound failure to invest. All of these deficits lie before us and lead me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. This is our legacy, the economic and physical world that we are choosing to leave to those who follow us. How did we get here? How did this happen? Next, we move on to assets to see how they stack up against our debts and our national failure to save. Chapter 14, Assets and Demographics. As we learned in previous sections, our nation has historic, never-before-seen levels of debt and an historic failure to save. Now, some would say it's not reasonable to look only at debt and savings. One also has to consider assets. After all, does it really matter if you have no savings and $1 million of debt if you have assets worth $10 million? Well, that's a great point. So we're going to take a look at assets here. All right, so what's an asset? One definition is items of ownership convertible into cash, total resources of a person or business as cash, notes and accounts receivable, securities, inventories, goodwill, fixtures, machinery, or real estate. So, an asset is something of value that can be converted to cash or provides access to or enhances a flow of cash. If we said simply that assets are deposits, real estate, stocks or bonds, and the stuff we own, we'd pretty much cover the vast majority of what we consider to be our assets. As we saw earlier, the liabilities and assets of the U.S. and state governments are really the liabilities of its citizens. But do remember, as we noted in Chapter 13, the U.S. government has a total net worth of negative $50 to $85 trillion. In fact, that mismatch between assets and liabilities does not belong to the U.S. government. It belongs to you and me and everybody else. Our national debts and liabilities are, well, ours. On the private side, the assets of companies belong entirely to the bondholders and shareholders of that company, not the company itself. And who are those? Ultimately, private citizens. Since we can pool citizens into households, we could examine household assets, deduct some relevant liabilities, and get a decent view of where things stand. And we do this because the Federal Reserve happens to track net worth at the household level, and this data is routinely and widely reported in the media. In fact, according to the Federal Reserve, household net worth has exploded by nearly $20 trillion in only 5 years, an astonishing feat, and it represents more wealth than our country managed to amass from its inception until the late 1980s. And these are net assets, so the Federal Reserve and many in the media take the position that with just under $60 trillion in net worth, Americans are doing just fine and our rapidly climbing levels of debt are no cause for concern. But before we get too excited about the astonishing wealth indicated here, there are two key oversights and a fallacy hidden in this report, of which you should be aware. As always, the devil's in the details. Before I address those, I want you to observe this period right here, spanning from 2000 to 2003. That dip in the net worth of households was due to the stock market collapse that ran from 2000 to 2003 and caused such great panic at the Fed that Greenspan lowered interest rates to the emergency rate of 1%, thereby igniting the greatest of housing and credit bubbles in all of history. And this decline in net worth leads to this observation. Debt is fixed. When you take on a debt, there it placidly sits, until and unless you make payments on it. Debts do not vary with the general economic conditions, or whether you get a raise or lose your job. Assets, on the other hand, are variable, sometimes gaining and sometimes losing value. And so this leads to the 8th key concept of the crash course. Debts are fixed, but assets are variable. Okay, where did that $19.8 trillion in new wealth come from? Well, about 80% of that growth came from a rise in financial assets, and the remaining 20% came from growth in real estate and other tangible assets. When we look at how much of each type there was, we see that 72% of the total net worth consists of financial assets, totaling about $41 trillion, while the tangible assets are the remaining 28% and total around $16 trillion. If we examine these assets a little more closely, we see that the $41 trillion worth of financial assets consist of things like pension funds, the assets of privately held businesses, deposits, stocks, and bonds, which we can roughly recompose into these 4 main classes. stocks, bonds, cash or deposits, and the assets of privately held businesses. The other bucket of $16 trillion in tangible assets consists primarily of real estate, which is 75% of this bucket, and consumer durables, which would be your car, your dryer, and your snowblower if you happen to have one. For every single one of all of these assets on this page, except cash, in order to liberate the wealth from these assets, you'd have to sell them first. Now, one general rule of asset markets goes like this. Things go up in price when there are more buyers than sellers, and things go down in price when there are more sellers than buyers. Hold on to that thought for when we get to demographics. Now, let me expose a great fallacy of the household wealth report. I'll use real estate to make the point. Suppose you have a house that you bought for $250,000, and over time, say the last 5 years, it went up in assessed value to $500,000. The Fed would record this as a $250,000 increase in your net wealth. But there's really no way for you to easily get to that wealth. Sure, you could borrow against that, but that does not liberate the wealth. It only exchanges an amount of it for debt. But suppose that you sold your house. Well, if you wanted to move into an equivalent house, guess what? They've all gone up in price along with yours, and so you have to spend $500,000 for an equivalent house. So, nope, no wealth was liberated there. In fact, the only way to liberate the wealth in your house is to downsize and buy a smaller one, or rent. So here's the rhetorical question of the day. How could everyone downsize? You might be able to, but on balance, everybody can't. At least not without creating a massive glut of large homes and a desperate shortage of smaller ones. And if everyone can't do this, then it means that it's impossible to ever release the full value or embodied wealth of all the houses. So the wealth number is fun to look at individually, but it is more or less meaningless as a whole. This same dynamic is true for other assets as well. Sufficient buyers are essential, or the wealth is as good as stranded. I mentioned that there are also two big oversights in the household wealth report, and the first is that the Fed mysteriously does not include the general liabilities of the government when calculating household net wealth. Wouldn't it make sense for the Fed to offset these against household wealth? After all, who else besides the taxpayers living in households are going to pay off those liabilities? Nobody. That's who. If the Fed did perform this offset, household net worth would plunge below zero. So I can guess why this comparison is never made. The second oversight is that the data is presented as if it applied to our entire country in a fairly even and useful manner. It does not. The top 1% owns 35% of all net household wealth, and, looking at stocks only, owns 56% of all stock by value. If you can't see it, I apologize. The top 1% is represented by a very thin red smear at the top of that column there. It's great that our stock market keeps powering higher, but for every $1 trillion it goes up, 560 billion of that goes to only 1 out of 100 households. The top 20%, which includes the top 1%, owns 85% of all household net wealth and 80% of all stocks by value. This means that the bottom 80% of the citizens of this country, represented in yellow, holds only 15% of the total wealth of this country. Remember, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. More immediately, this tells us that our credit crisis is going to be worse than advertised. Just as was true of the wealth gap in the late 1920s, before the onset of the Great Depression, the severity of the crisis will not depend on average wealth, but on the distribution of the wealth. If a large swath of the population lacks the means to weather the storm, then that storm will be longer and harsher than otherwise would be the case. So what does it mean that 80% of our population possesses a meager 15% of the total wealth? For one thing, it means that recent efforts by the Fed to provide massive amounts of liquidity to support the biggest and wealthiest banks at the inflationary expense of the lower classes were not only misguided, but they were cruel and unusual. This leads to an easy prediction to make. The wealth gap in the United States will hamper our recovery and deepen the downturn. In order to really understand why I've been harping on this notion of assets being variable and their value being dependent on the ratio of buyers to sellers, we'll need to take a quick trip into demographics. Recall that the U.S. government has not saved in any of its entitlement programs, and that it has a massive shortfall in them, measuring the tens of trillions of dollars. That situation comes about because the entitlement programs are really wealth transfer programs, not savings accounts, and so they depend on a significant surplus of current workers to retirees. The shortfalls in these programs are being exacerbated by a troubling trend. In 1950, there were 7 workers per retiree, and the system was balanced. By 2005, that ratio had dropped to only 5 to 1, and the system was already exhibiting signs of distress. By 2030, that ratio will have plummeted to a thoroughly unworkable value of less than 3 to 1. And this trend comes about as a feature of the so-called baby boom. This is a demographic chart of the United States, and each bar represents a clustering of all the people who are within a 5-year wide age window, as seen on the left axis. The baby boomers number around 75 million strong and roughly occupy these 4 bands. While it may not seem like much, the hole that exists in the population behind the baby boomers represents an enormous challenge and even threat to our entitlement programs and will greatly complicate our efforts to resolve our levels of debt and our national failure to save. A more normal population distribution, if you will, and the kind that humans evolved with over countless millennia, looks like this: a pyramid. Again, this shows 5-year wide age brackets, with men in red and women in yellow. This distribution is capable of supporting an entitlement program, such as the one in the US, that is based on transferring wealth directly from workers to retirees. But when we cast this chart forward to 2000, the baby boomer bulge is quite apparent. Besides the challenge that this demographic profile offers to the entitlement programs, an even larger challenge is presented to both the debt and savings issues I painted in previous chapters, and even to the value of our assets. Here's what I mean. The boomers are the wealthiest generation ever. They hold nearly all of the assets, and they will need to dispose of those assets to fund their retirements. Who exactly are the boomers planning on selling their assets to? This guy? Even if his generation somehow could afford to buy all these assets, there simply aren't enough people in his generation to buy them. In order to fund their retirement dreams, boomers are going to have to sell off their assets. And again, we might wonder, to whom exactly? And lastly, if the massive accumulation of debt over the past 23 years was predicated on the assumption that the future will be much larger than the present, we might also question how exactly that will come to pass if boomers are retiring en masse and there are fewer behind them to take their place. Man, the next generation better be prepared to work really, really hard. Too bad they're graduating with the highest levels of college debt ever recorded. This sort of demographic profile will be with us for decades and cannot be wished away or fixed by some clever policy. It is simply a fact of life, and one that we do well to recognize and plan for rather than ignore. Boomer retirement has already begun, and the pace of this will accelerate rapidly over the next 15 years, which will make the 20-teens quite interesting, and leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. Next time, we're going to discuss asset bubbles. Understanding the destructive dynamics of bubbles is critical if you want to know what's coming next and why the Federal Reserve is panicking right now. Okay, now that we've taken a look at U.S. assets, we need to spend some time understanding what an asset bubble is, how one might form, and the consequences of the aftermath. And we are specifically going to examine the housing bubble in detail because it's happening right now and is the largest bubble in all of history and will probably be the most destructive. Through the long sweep of history, the bursting of asset bubbles has nearly always been traumatic. Social, political, and economic upheavals have a bad habit of following asset bubbles, while wealth destruction is a guaranteed feature. Along the continuum of irrational financial behavior, it can be tricky to tell the difference between a bubble, a mania, and a mere touch of exuberance. A bubble is reserved for the height of folly, and history is rich with folly. Bubbles used to happen once every generation or so, because it took time to forget the pain from the damage. Today, We are facing the bursting of a second major asset bubble, housing, spaced less than 10 years from the bursting of the dot-com bubble. This is simply astounding and thoroughly unprecedented. So how would we know that we're in an asset bubble? What do they look like? And what can we expect when one bursts? The Fed famously likes to claim that you can't spot one until it bursts. But actually you can, and the definition is pretty simple. A bubble exists when asset price inflation rises beyond what incomes can sustain. A bubble represents people abandoning reason and prudence for hope and greed. Out of that prior list, let's look at one of the more interesting bubbles that happened in Holland in the 1600s. For some reason, the people of that time became infatuated with tulips, saw them as a surefire path to riches, and a financial mania set in. The bubble began when beautiful and unique variants in tulip coloration were developed and bulbs began trading at higher and higher amounts as the speculative frenzy built. At the height of the bubble, a single bulb of the most highly sought-after example, the Semper Augustus, seen here, commanded the same selling price as the finest house on the finest canal. But eventually, people figured out that you actually could grow quite a few tulip bulbs if you set your mind to it, and that perhaps bulbs were, after all, just bulbs. It is recorded that the tulip craze ended even more suddenly than it began, ending almost in a single day at the start of the new selling season in February of 1637. On that day, a silent whistle blew that only dogs and buyers could hear, and prices crashed. This example illustrates two characteristics of bubbles. First, that they are self-reinforcing on the way up, meaning that higher prices become the justification for higher prices. And second, that once the illusion is lifted, the game is suddenly and permanently over. A second example of a bubble comes from the 1700s and goes by the name the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company was an English company granted a monopoly to trade with South America under a treaty with Spain. The fact that the company was rather ordinary in its profits prior to the government monopoly did not deter people from speculating wildly about its potential future value, and the share price rose dramatically. Nor were people deterred by the fact that the company was billed as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Sir Isaac Newton, when asked about the continually rising stock price of the South Sea Company, said that he could not calculate the madness of people. He may have invented calculus and described universal gravitation, but he also ended up losing over 20,000 pounds to the bursting bubble, proving that intelligence is no guarantee of avoiding being swept up in the animal instincts of a bubble. In 1720, the mania took off, displaying a textbook perfect example of an asset bubble. Here we see reflected two additional essential features of bubbles. First, they are roughly symmetrical in time, and second, they are symmetrical in price. That is, however long it took to create the bubble is roughly the amount of time it will take to unwind the bubble, and prices usually get fully retraced, if not a bit more. Here we can see those features in perfect form. Keep an eye on this shape. We'll be seeing it again and again. And here, in a chart of the Dow Jones beginning in 1921, we can see that the stock bubble that preceded the Great Depression followed the same rough trajectory, requiring about as much time to deflate as it did to inflate, and that prices roughly returned to the levels from which they started. And here's the stock price of GM in the blue line between the years 1912 and 1922, and Intel in the red line between 1992 and 2002, periods during which both stocks were swept up in bubbles. Here we might also note that the price data looks very similar for both stocks, despite the fact that they reflect a car company and a high-tech chip manufacturer separated by a span of 80 years. The fact that bubbles display the same price behaviors over the centuries tells us that they are not artifacts of particular financial systems, but rather are shaped by human emotions, and those have not changed through the years, and this is why you should hold on to your wallet anytime you hear the words, "This time it's different." Somewhere along the way, people started to believe this about houses, and it got to the point that people began to really believe that a house was a path to riches. And even better, it was a magical path that would transport you to Easy Street, even if you sat on your sofa the whole time drinking beer. Now, there's simply no way for this to be true, and we should have known better. Over the long haul, house prices will be set by whatever it costs to build a new house, meaning that inflation will dictate house prices. This amazing chart of inflation-adjusted house prices created by Robert Shiller reveals that between 1890 and 1998, house prices track the rate of inflation very closely. In this chart, when the line is rising, houses are appreciating in price faster than the rate of inflation, and anytime the line is falling, they are losing ground compared to inflation. Over this entire 118-year period, house prices averaged 101.2, meaning that inflation-adjusted house prices roughly tracked inflation across this entire sweep of history. When prices got too low, they rose, and when they got too high, they fell. See this little bump right here? That was a property bubble that I still remember clearly because it impacted the Northeast where I lived at the time, and I got to ride my bike through abandoned construction projects, which was cool. Notice that this property bubble returned to baseline in a fairly symmetrical fashion, as did the property bubble of 1989. Well, if those were property bubbles, then what's this? This housing bubble is one that has no historical precedent and is massively out of proportion to anything we've experienced before. There is nothing even remotely close to it in magnitude, so we are left without any history to guide us as to what the impacts are likely to be. And also note that this bubble did not suddenly begin in 2004. It began in 1998 and had eclipsed the past two bubbles by the year 2000. You might ask yourself, if the Federal Reserve had access to this data and knew we had a property bubble on our hands as early as 2000, why did they continue to aggressively lower interest rates to 1% and hold them there between the years 2003 and 2004? Now that's a darn good question, and I'll get to that in a minute. Based on this chart, where and when might we expect this bubble to finally bottom out? Well, symmetry suggests the bottom will be somewhere around 2015, while history might suggest that prices will decline by roughly 50% in real terms. The other way that we could look at all of this is in terms of affordability. Over the long haul, it is impossible for median house prices to rise faster than median incomes. Why? Because the amount that people can afford to pay sets a limit on house prices. Here's a chart I put together that compares median incomes to median house prices. The bubbles of 1979 and 1989 are not very dramatic on this graph, but there they are, marked by the black arrows. The fact that median incomes did not deviate very far from those prior bubbly house prices helped to limit the impact of the bursting of those bubbles, painful though they were, because incomes and house prices did not have to travel very far to meet up again. This time, again, we have no historical precedent for the gap between income gains and house prices, and we see disturbing signs as early as 1999 that things were getting seriously off track. Based on income gains alone, how much would house prices have to fall to bring these lines back together? The answer is 34%, nationally, indicating that we've still got a long way to go. Given the propensity of bubbles to overshoot to the downside, we can't entirely discount that a 40 or 50% decline is in the cards. And here we might also guesstimate that house prices would bottom somewhere in the vicinity of 2012 to 2015. Remember, a bubble exists when asset price inflation rises beyond what incomes can sustain, and that's exactly what we see in this chart. So where was the Fed during all of this? They were busy writing research papers convincing themselves that there was no housing bubble, as seen in this 2004 Fed study entitled, "Are Home Prices the Next Bubble?" The main summary of this study started off on a good note, stating, "Home prices have been rising strongly since the mid-1990s, prompting concerns that a bubble exists in this asset class and that home prices are vulnerable to a collapse that could harm the U.S. economy." But then the main conclusion of the paper veered sharply off into a ditch, reading, "A close analysis of the U.S. housing market in recent years, however, finds little basis for such concerns. The marked upturn in home prices is largely attributable to strong market fundamentals. Home prices have essentially moved in line with increases in family income and declines in nominal mortgage interest rates." Essentially moved in line with increases in family income? What? One of the most widely known facts of our time is that family incomes have not moved up at all over the past 8 years on an inflation-adjusted basis, and is one of the principal economic failures of this decade. This just goes to show that the Federal Reserve is either stocked with inept or biased researchers, and of the two, I'm not sure which makes me feel worse about our chances of pulling through this mess. But the Fed's researchers were simply doing what millions of people did. namely falling prey to believing that somehow this time it's different. But that's just how bubbles are. People take leave of their senses, use all manner of rationales to justify their positions, but then, suddenly, one day the illusion lifts and what seemed to be unassailably true no longer makes any sense at all. While it's tempting to lay the blame for what's happening on the housing bubble, it's important to remember that the dramatic rise in house prices was itself just a symptom of a credit bubble run amok. Total credit at the end of 2000, when the stock bubble was bursting, stood at $27 trillion. By the end of 2007, it stood at an astounding $48 trillion. This $21 trillion increase in borrowing is 5 times larger than the increase in U.S. GDP over the same period of time. Any attempt to understand the housing bubble has to be viewed against the backdrop of this massive increase in debt. But as we noted in an earlier chapter, this credit bubble has been going on for 25 years. Unwinding a multi-generational debt binge is going to require some enormous changes in attitudes and habits. One reason that any bubble, but especially a housing bubble like this one, is so destructive is because so many bad investments are made along the way. Too many houses were built, too many shopping centers, too many condos, and nearly all of them too large and ill-positioned for a future of expensive energy. Sorry to say, but all those trillions of dollars were wasted, and worse, stole opportunities from the things that really needed that money more. The Austrian School of Economics has a very crisp and historically accurate definition of how a credit bubble ends. According to Ludwig von Mises, there is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis should come sooner as a result of a voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency system involved. This is a view I happen to ascribe to and explains my strong preference for placing my wealth out of the path of a potential dollar collapse. As a nation, we've undertaken desperate measures to avoid abandoning the continuation of our credit expansion, leaving a final catastrophe of the currency as our most likely outcome. As for the timing, it could hardly be worse. Dealing with a bursting housing bubble is not the sort of challenge we need at this particular moment in history, but here we are. The stewardship and vision displayed by the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. in bringing all of this about has been utterly atrocious. So what can we expect from a collapsing credit bubble? Simply put, everything that fed upon and grew as a consequence of too much easy credit will collapse. I am especially leery of financial stocks and low-grade bonds, and of course, real estate. I see very few conventional ways to protect one's wealth, and so I invite you to begin asking yourself, and if you have one, you're a financial advisor, some very hard questions about the safety of your holdings. You'll be glad you did. Remember, this time it's probably not different. What if it's true, as Kevin Phillips recently stated in an article in Harper's, that ever since the 1960s, Washington has gulled its citizens and creditors by debasing official statistics, the vital instruments with which the vigor and muscle of the American economy are measured? What if it turned out that our individual, corporate, and government decision-making was based on deeply misleading, if not provably false data? That's what we're going to take a look at here by examining the ways that inflation and gross domestic product, or GDP, are measured. As you know, inflation is a matter of active policy. Too little in our current banking system risks failure. Too much, and the majority of people noticeably lose their savings, which makes them politically restive. So keeping inflation at a Goldilocks temperature, not too hot and not too cold, is the name of the game. Inflation has two components. The first is the simple pressure on prices due to too much money floating around. The second component lies with people's expectations of future inflation. If expectations are that inflation will be tame, they are said to be well anchored. If people expect prices to rise, they tend to spend their money now while the getting is still good, and this serves to fuel further inflation in a self-reinforcing manner. The faster people spend, the faster inflation rises. Zimbabwe is a perfect modern example of this dynamic in play. Accordingly, official inflation policy has two components. The first is regulating the money supply, and the second is anchoring your expectations. And how exactly is this anchoring accomplished? Over time, this has evolved into little more than telling you that inflation is a bit lower, or even a lot lower, than it actually is. The details of how this is done are more complicated, but worthy of your attention. Let me be clear. The tricks and subversions that we will examine did not arise with any particular administration or political party. Rather, they arose incrementally during every administration you would care to examine over the past 40 years. Under Kennedy, who disliked high unemployment numbers, a new classification was developed that scrubbed so-called discouraged workers from the headline data, causing unemployment figures to drop. Johnson created the unified budget that we currently enjoy, which rolls surplus Social Security funds into the general budget where they are spent, but then not reported as part of the deficit that you read about. Richard Nixon bequeathed us the so-called core inflation measure, which strips out food and fuel, which, as Barry Ritholtz says, is like reporting inflation ex-inflation. While it was Bill Clinton who left us with the current tangled statistical morass that is now our official method of measuring inflation. At every turn, a new way of measuring and reporting was derived that invariably served to make things seem a bit rosier than they actually were. Economic activity was higher, inflation was lower, sometimes a lot lower, and jobs were more plentiful. Unfortunately, the cumulative impact of all this data manipulation is that our measurements no longer match reality. We are, in effect, telling ourselves lies, and these fibs serve to distort our decisions and jeopardize our economic future. So let's begin with inflation, which is reported to us by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, in the form of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If you were to measure inflation, you'd probably track the cost of a basket of goods from one year to the next, subtract the two, and measure the difference. And your method would in fact be the way inflation was officially measured right on up through the early 1980s. But in 1996, Clinton implemented the Boskin Commission findings, which now have us measuring inflation using these three oddities: substitution, weighting, and hedonics. To begin on this list, we no longer simply measure the cost of goods and services from one year to the next because of something called the substitution effect. Thanks to the Boskin Commission, it is now assumed that when the price of something rises, people will switch to something cheaper. So anytime, say, that the price of salmon goes up too much, it is removed from the basket of goods and substituted with something cheaper like hot dogs. By this methodology, the BLS says that food costs rose 4.1% from 2007 to 2008. However, according to the Farm Bureau, which does not do this and simply tracks the exact same shopping basket of 30 goods from one year to the next, food prices rose 11.3% over the past year, compared to the BLS, who say that they only rose 4.1%. Now, that's a huge difference. One impact of using substitution is that our measure of inflation no longer measures the cost of living, but the cost of survival. Next, anything that rises too quickly in price is now subjected to so-called geometric weighting, in which goods and services that are rising most rapidly in price get a lower weighting in this CPI basket, under the assumption that people will use less of those things. Using the government's own statistics from two different sources, we find that healthcare is about 17% of our total economy, but it is only weighted as 6% of the CPI basket. Because healthcare costs are rising extremely rapidly, the impact of including a much smaller healthcare weighting is a reduction in reported inflation. By simply reinstating the actual level of healthcare spending, our reported CPI would be several percent higher. But the most outlandish adjustment of them all goes by the name hedonics, the Greek root of which means for the pleasure of. This adjustment is supposed to adjust for quality improvements, especially those that lead to greater enjoyment or utility of the product, but it has been badly overused. Here's an example. Tim LaFleur is a commodity specialist for televisions at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where the CPI is calculated. I'm guessing he works in a place that looks like this. In 2004, he noted that a 27-inch television selling for $329.99 was selling for the same price last year, but was now equipped with a better screen. After taking this subjective improvement into account, he adjusted the price of the TV downwards by $135, concluding that the screen improvement was the same as if the price of the TV had fallen by 29%. The price reflected in the CPI was not the actual retail store cost of $329.99, which is what it would cost you to buy, but $195. Bingo. At the BLS, TVs now cost less and inflation is heading down. At the store, they're still selling for $329.99. And hedonics are a one-way trip. If I get a new phone this year and it has some new buttons, the BLS will say that the price has dropped. But if this new phone only lasts 8 months instead of 30 years like my old phone, no adjustment will be made for that loss. In short, hedonics rests on the improbable assumption that new features are always beneficial and are synonymous with falling prices. Over the years, the BLS has expanded the use of hedonic adjustments and now applies them to everything from TVs to automobiles, washers, dryers, refrigerators, and even to college textbooks. Hedonics are now used to adjust as much as 46% of the total CPI. So what would happen if we were to strip out all the fuzzy statistical manipulations and calculate inflation like we used to do it? Luckily, John Williams of shadowstats.com has done exactly that, painstakingly following each statistical modification over time and reversing their effects. If inflation were calculated today the exact same way it was in the early 1980s, Mr. Williams finds that it would be running closer to 13% than the currently reported 5%. This is a stunning 8% difference, which explains much that we see around us. It explains why people have had to borrow more and have been able to save less because the real income was actually a lot lower than reported. A higher rate of inflation is consistent with weak labor markets and growing levels of debt. It fits the monetary growth data better. So many things that were difficult to explain under a low inflation reading suddenly make a lot of sense if inflation is assumed to be higher. The social cost to this self-deception is enormous. For starters, if inflation were calculated like it used to be, Social Security payments, whose increases are based on the CPI, would be 70% larger than today. Because Medicare increases are also tied to the CPI, hospitals are increasingly unable to balance their budgets, forcing many communities to lose services. These are real impacts. But besides paying out less in entitlement checks, by understating inflation, politicians gain in another very important way. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is how we tell ourselves that our economy is either doing well or doing poorly. In theory, the GDP is the sum total of all value-added transactions within our country in any given year. Here's an example, though, of how far from reality GDP has strayed. The reported number for 2003 was a GDP of $11 trillion, implying that $11 trillion of money-based, value-added economic transactions had occurred. However, nothing of the sort happened. First, that $11 trillion included $1.6 trillion of imputations, where it was assumed that economic value had been created, but no actual transactions took place. The largest of these imputations was the value that the owner of a house receives by not having to pay themselves rent. Did you follow that? If you own your house, the government adds how much they think you should have been paying yourself in rent to live there, and adds that amount to the GDP. Another is the benefit that you receive from the free checking provided by your bank, which is imputed to have a value because if it weren't free, then you'd have to pay for it. So that value is guesstimated and added to the GDP as well. Together, just these two imputations add up to over $1 trillion of our reported GDP. Next, the GDP has many elements that are hedonically adjusted. For instance, computers are hedonically adjusted to account for the idea that because they are faster and more feature-rich than in past years, they must be contributing more to our economic output than their price alone would indicate. So if a $1,000 computer were sold, it would be recorded as contributing more than $1,000 to the GDP. Of course, that extra money is fictitious in the sense that it never traded hands and it doesn't exist. What's interesting is that for the purposes of inflation measurements, hedonic adjustments are used to reduce the apparent price of computers, but for GDP calculations, hedonic adjustments are used to boost their apparent price. Hedonics, therefore, are used to maneuver prices higher or lower, depending on which outcome makes things look more favorable. So, what were the total hedonic adjustments in 2003? An additional whopping $2.3 trillion. Taken together, these mean that $3.9 trillion, or fully 35% of our reported GDP, was not based on transactions that you could witness, record, or touch. They were guessed at, modeled, or imputed, but they did not show up in any bank accounts because no cash ever changed hands. As an aside, when you hear people say things like, our debt to GDP is still quite low, or income taxes as a percentage of GDP are historically low, It's important to remember that because GDP is artificially high, any ratio where GDP is in the denominator will be artificially low. Now, let's tie in inflation to the GDP story. The GDP you read about is always inflation adjusted and reported after inflation is subtracted from it. This is called the real GDP, while the pre-inflation adjusted number is called the nominal GDP. This is an important thing to do because GDP is supposed to measure real output, not the impact of inflation. Here's an example. If our economy consisted of producing lava lamps, and we produced one of them in one year and one of them the next year, we'd want to record our GDP growth rate as 0 because our output is exactly the same in both years. So, if we sold a lava lamp for $100 one year, but $110 the next, we'd accidentally record a 10% GDP increase if we didn't back out the price increases. So in this example, the real lava lamp economy has a value of $100, while the nominal lava lamp economy is $110. And because we're trying to measure the real economy, inflation must be removed from the picture. Now we can begin to understand the second powerful reason that DC loves a low inflation reading. It's because GDP is expressed in real terms. It works like this. In the third quarter of 2007, it was reported that we experienced a very surprising and strong 4.9% rate of GDP growth. At the time, there were many proud officials declaring that certain tax cuts or these programs or whatnot were responsible for this excellent news. Less well reported was the fact that nominal GDP was 5.9%, from which was deducted the jaw-droppingly low inflation reading of 1%, giving us the final result of 4.9%. In order to believe this 4.9% figure, you have to first believe that our nation was experiencing a 1% rate of inflation during the same period that oil was first approaching $100 a barrel, and inflation was obviously and irrefutably exploding all over the globe. Lest you think I've cherry-picked an accidental one-time embarrassing statistical BLS moment here, here's a chart of the so-called GDP deflator, which is the specific measure of inflation that is subtracted from nominal GDP to yield the reported real GDP. As you can see, for the past 15 quarters, the Bureau of Economic Analysis has been serenely and systematically subtracting lower and lower amounts of inflation, which simply flies in the face of both real-world inflation data and common sense. Remember, each percent that inflation is understated equals a full percent that GDP is overstated. If this is not lying to ourselves, then delusional is the next word that comes to my mind. If, instead, we make our own assumptions about inflation, or we use those of John Williams, and subtract these from the reported GDP numbers, then we find that we've been in a solid recession for quite a while now. Suddenly a lot of things that were difficult to understand make perfect sense. Contracting businesses, rising foreclosures, job losses, rising budget deficits, falling tax revenues, declining auto sales, all of these are consistent with recession, and not expansion. The same sort of statistical wizardry that we've just explored here is performed on income, unemployment figures, house prices, budget deficits, and virtually every other government-supplied economic statistic you can think of. Each is laced with a long series of lopsided imperfections that inevitably paint a rosier picture than is warranted. We are now in the midst of a fearful credit crisis, a bursting bubble, and the first wave of boomer retirements, and solid, credible information is what we need as a beacon to find our way out. To close with Kevin Phillips again, our nation may truly regret losing sight of history, risk, and common sense. I couldn't agree more. Well, that's it for Fuzzy Numbers. Join me next time for peak oil and its relationship to our economic future. Okay, we're up to the chapter on peak oil, and this one is a doozy. If you think all the way back to chapter 3, I said I was going to connect the 3 E's, and we are now about to connect the economy to energy. This is one of the most important chapters. It's a big subject. And I wish to acknowledge that much of this chapter stands on the shoulders of the hundreds of dedicated people who have gathered the data, made the points, and tirelessly worked to advance our understanding of the role of energy in our lives. Energy is the lifeblood of any economy. But when an economy is based on an exponential debt-based money system, and that is based on exponentially increasing energy supplies, The supply of that energy deserves your very highest attention. And when we look at U.S. energy use, we see in this chart from the Department of Energy that oil represents over 50% of our total yearly energy use, while oil and natural gas together represent over 75%. We're going to examine oil in detail, although pretty much everything I'm about to say about oil applies equally to natural gas. So we'll be discussing more than 3/4 of our total energy situation. In order to understand what peak oil means, we need to share a common understanding about how oil fields work and how oil is extracted. A common misperception is that an oil rig is plunked down over an oil field, a pipe is inserted, and then oil gushes out from a big underground lake or cavern that eventually gets sucked dry. It turns out that it's pretty much just solid rock down there, and oil is only found in porous rocks like sandstone that permit the oil to flow through the rock's crevices and pores. No vast caverns or lakes of oil exist down there. Oil has to be very carefully extracted from what turns out to be a solid rock matrix. It's better to think of an oil field like a margarita, where the oil is the tequila mix and the rock is the crushed ice. When an oil field is tapped, we find that the amount of oil that comes out of it follows a very prescribed pattern over time that ends up resembling a bell curve. At first, shortly after the drink is discovered, there's just one straw in our margarita. But then, with growing excitement, more and more straws are stuck in, and more drink flows out of the glass at a faster rate. But then that dreaded slurping sound begins, and now, no matter how many new straws we insert, the amount of margarita coming out of the glass declines until it is all gone, and we're only left with ice. That's pretty much how an oil field works. Every oil field exploited to date has exhibited the same basic extraction profile. And what is true for one is equally true when we measure across many oil fields and then sum the result. Because individual fields peak, so do collections of fields. Peak oil, then, is not an abstract theory so much as it is a description of an extremely well-characterized physical process. How much remains to be discovered is a theory, but the process by which oil fields become depleted is rather well understood. Peak oil is simply a fact. Also, peak oil is not synonymous with running out of oil. At the moment of peak, somewhere right around half the oil still remains. But something interesting happens at the halfway mark. Where oil gushed out under pressure at first, the back half usually has to get laboriously pumped out of the ground at higher cost. Where every barrel of oil was cheaper to extract on the way up, the reverse is true on the way down. Each barrel becomes more costly in terms of time and money and energy to extract. Eventually, it costs more to extract a barrel of oil than it is worth, and that's when an oil field is abandoned. Here's our experience with oil in the United States. From the first well drilled in 1859 in Titus, Pennsylvania, until 1970, more and more oil was progressively pumped out of the ground. But after that point, less and less came out of the ground. It is said then that the U.S. hit a peak of oil production at around 1970 at just under 10 million barrels a day, and today produces just a little over 5 million barrels a day. Those are the facts. Counting only our crude oil consumption here, the remaining balance of our 15 million barrel a day crude oil habit is met by imports. That is, we import 2/3 of our daily petroleum needs. Now, in order to produce oil, you have to first find oil, right? It's pretty hard to pump something you haven't found. Here's the interesting part. U.S. oil discoveries peaked in 1930, which yields a gap between a peak in discovery and a peak in production of 40 years. Remember that number. Here's an interesting aside. Suppose we wanted to become independent from imported oil and decided to replace those 10 million imported barrels with some other form of energy. Those 10 million barrels represent the same energy equivalent as 750 nuclear power plants. Considering the issues we have with 104 we have operating right now, I think it's safe to say nuclear power is not a realistic candidate for eliminating oil imports. Well then, by how much would we have to increase, say, our solar, wind, biomass, renewable energy production? There, we'd have to increase our currently installed base by a factor of 2,000. Not 2,000%, 2,000 times as much. When we look at worldwide oil discoveries, we find that those increased in every decade up to the 1960s, and then have decreased in every decade since then, with future projections looking even more grim. The exact peak of discovery? That was in 1964, 44 years ago, and that is another cold, hard, indisputable fact. Remember, in order to produce oil, you have to find it first. So to all the advocates out there who hope that lots of oil remains to be found, possibly of an abiotic origin, I say, let's find it. And here is the third and final fact about production that I want to present. This is a chart of global, conventional crude oil production only. It leaves out biofuels and some other liquids. But conventional crude is the easy, high energy yield stuff, and that is what the world's past 100 years of growth has been built upon. We can see here that since mid-2004, for some reason, oil production has been flat. Whatever the reason for this is, it isn't price, because oil has climbed from $50 a barrel to $120 a barrel as of today. If ever there was a strong incentive to get oil out of the ground and off to market, this would be it. Is it possible, then, that this chart is telling us that conventional crude oil production is at peak? The twin signals of rapidly rising price and flat production certainly make a compelling argument that this is the case. Intriguingly, the global peak in discoveries was exactly 40 years prior to the leveling off of this production graph, possibly echoing the gap between the peak of U.S. discovery and production. I'm soft-pedaling this to an enormous degree. This chart concerns me. Let me be blunt. If we are already at peak, as these data suggest is possible, then we're in trouble. However, the most urgent issue before us does not lie with identifying the precise moment of peak oil. That is, truthfully, an academic distraction because the economic dislocations will begin as soon as there's a gap between supply and demand. Here's a very simple and clever way to think about the supply and demand problem that was developed by a Dallas geologist named Jeffrey Brown, which he calls the export land model. Suppose we have a hypothetical country that produces 2 million barrels of crude a day, but that is declining at 5% a year. We'd note that they'd be able to export 2 million barrels, and then after 10 years, they would still be able to export 1.25 million barrels a day. This seems manageable. But now suppose that this country uses oil themselves, as all countries do, and they are consuming 1 million barrels a day, and this internal demand is itself increasing at 2.5% a year. This is also reasonable. What happens to exports under this model? They go to zero in 10 years. Where we expected exports, we get nothing. This is the miracle of compounding, but in reverse, where exports are eaten into from both ends. It turns out that this is a very realistic scenario because we can already observe that production is declining even as demand is increasing in a number of countries. In the case of Mexico, currently the number 3 supplier of oil exports to the U.S., production declines and demand growth will entirely eliminate their exports by the year 2011 or 2012. Now, where in the world is the U.S. going to find a brand new number 3 oil supplier in the next 3 to 4 years? When world production will peak is a matter of some dispute, with estimates ranging from right now to some 30 years away. But as I said before, the precise moment of the peak is really just an academic concern. What we need to be most concerned with is that day that world demand outstrips available supply. It is at that moment of crossover that the oil markets will change forever and probably quite suddenly. First, we'll see massive price hikes. That's a given. But do you remember the food shortages that seemingly erupted overnight back in February of 2008? Those were triggered by the perception of demand exceeding supply, which led to an immediate export ban on food shipments by many countries. This same dynamic of national hoarding will certainly be a feature of the global oil market once the perception of shortage takes hold. When that happens, our concerns about price will be trumped by our fears of shortages. In order to understand why oil is so important to our economy and our daily lives, we have to understand something about what it does for us. We value any source of energy because we can harness it to do work for us. For example, every time you turn on a 100-watt light bulb, it is the same as if you had a fit human being in the basement pedaling as hard as they could to keep that bulb lit. That is how much energy a single light bulb uses. In the background, While you run water, take hot showers, and vacuum the floor, it is as if your house is employing the services of 50 such extremely fit bike riders. This slave count, if you will, exceeds that of kings in times past. It can truly be said that we are all living like kings. Although we may not appreciate that because it all seems so ordinary that we take it for granted sometimes. And how much work is embodied in a gallon of gasoline, our most favorite substance of them all? Well, if you put a single gallon in a car, drove it until it ran out, and then turned around and pushed that car home, you'd find out. It turns out that a gallon of gas has the equivalent energy of 500 hours of hard human labor, or 12 and a half 40-hour work weeks. So then how much is a gallon of gas worth, would we say? $4? $10? If you wanted to pay this poor man $15 an hour to push your car home, then we might value a gallon of gas at $7,500. Here's another example. It has been calculated that the amount of food that the average North American citizen consumes in a year requires the equivalent of 400 gallons of petroleum to produce and ship. 400 gallons of petroleum per person per year just for food. At $4 a gallon, that works out to $1,600 of your yearly food bill being spent on fuel, which doesn't sound too extreme. However, when we consider that those 400 gallons represent the energy equivalent of 100 humans working year-round at 40 hours a week, then it takes on an entirely different meaning. This puts your diet well out of the reach of most kings of times past. Just to put this in context, as it is currently configured, food production and distribution uses fully 2/3 of our domestic oil production. This is one reason why a cessation of imports would be, shall we say, disruptive. Besides the way that oil works tirelessly in the background to make our lives easy beyond historical measure, oil is a miracle in other ways. In this picture, a typical American family was asked to cart out onto their front lawn everything in their house that was derived from oil. That's quite a sight. How easily could we replace the role of oil in our style of consumer-led, growth-based economy? Not very. We currently use oil mainly for transportation, sitting right at around 70% of all oil consumption. The next biggest block is for industrial purposes, followed by residential, which means heating oil. This last tiny little sliver, that's oil used to generate electricity. With the exception of biofuels, which I'll get to later, all renewable energy resources either provide heat or electricity, meaning that even if we entirely replaced all of the electricity and heat currently provided by oil with renewables, we'd only be addressing these tiny slices right here. And in the industrial processes, oil is the primary input feedstock to innumerable necessities of life, such as fertilizer, plastics, paint, synthetic fibers, chemical processes, and flying around. When we consider other potential fuel sources, we find that they are mostly incapable of fulfilling these needs. Biofuels and coal could potentially fill some of these functions, but certainly not without a massive reinvestment program, and not anytime soon. So let's review a few key facts. You have to find oil before you can produce it. And key fact number one here is that world oil discoveries peaked in 1964. U.S. discoveries peaked in 1930, and 40 years later, production peaked. We are now 44 years after the global discovery peak. That's a fact. Key fact number two is that world production of conventional crude has been flat for the past 4 years, even as prices have increased by 140%. Taken together, key facts number one and number two suggest the possibility that peak oil is already upon us. If true, then we are going to wish with all our hearts that we had begun preparing for this moment a decade or more ago. Key fact number three is that U.S. oil imports are the energy equivalent of more than 750 nuclear power plants, which is 7 times as many nuclear plants as currently exist here, and nearly twice the total number of nuclear plants in the entire world. Key concept number 9 of the crash course, then, is that peak oil is a well-defined process that is nothing more than a physical description of how oil fields age. We have literally thousands of studied examples under our belts, and this is not open to debate. Only when the peak might arrive is up for discussion. Mostly hidden from us in plain sight is key concept number 10. The amount of work that oil performs for you is equivalent to having hundreds of slaves. It is this work that makes our lives what they are, staggeringly comfortable by historical standards. The average middle-class life in Western society today would be the envy of most kings in times past. Key concept number 11 is that oil is a magical substance of finite supply but unlimited importance. This cannot be overstated. Transitioning from one fuel source to another is a devilishly expensive proposition, posing enormous challenges with respect to cost, scale, and time. Our species transitioned over many years from wood to coal because coal was a better fuel source. And we transitioned over several decades from coal to oil for the same reason. Nobody has been able to advance any candidates as our next source of energy. Technology is not a source of energy. It may help us to exploit our energy more efficiently, but it would be a big mistake to confuse technology with an energy source. And finally, what we need to keep a careful eye out for is the supply of oil being exceeded by demand. And this raises key concept number 12. Oil exports are being hit two ways, by rising demand and declining production. This raises the prospect that the moment when the world's nations finally realize there's not enough oil to supply everybody may come much sooner than most suspect. Exponential functions are hard for most humans to grasp, and oil exports are being exponentially squeezed in two directions, subjecting them to a surprisingly high rate of decline. And this completes an immensely brief tour through peak oil. If you've not already done so, you owe it to yourself to become knowledgeable on this subject due to its unequaled importance. I have links aplenty on the essential books, essential articles, and resources pages of my site. In the next section, we will discuss the intersection between energy and the economy, and I will make the point that it was no accident that our exponential, debt-based money system grew up at precisely the same moment that a new source of high-quality energy was discovered that proved capable of increasing exponentially right alongside it. Please join me as I explore the importance of energy to our particular economic and monetary systems in Chapter 17b, Energy Economics. Thank you for your attention. Now we embark on the precise line of thinking that completely dominates my investing and purchasing habits, and I call it energy economics. When oil first began to be used for industrial purposes, world population stood at 1.5 billion and sailing ships still plied the waters alongside coal steamers. Since then, population has expanded more than 4 times, the world's economy by more than 20 times, and energy use more than 40-fold. We are all familiar with the massive benefits that accrued from this explosive liberation of human potential. In order to appreciate the delicacy of the continuation of this abundance, we need to understand the actual role of energy in forming our society. If we recall back to Crash Course Chapter 5, I made the point that both growth and prosperity are dependent on surplus. They are, and so is one other equally important social element. If we make this yellow box represent the total food energy available to a people, and then set it to exactly equal the amount of food those people need to get more food to stay alive, then we'd find that their society would be very rudimentary and not terribly complex. If instead these same people were able to produce just 1.2 calories for every 1 calorie expended, then they'd have the exact energy balance that existed in medieval times. This skinny 20% surplus allotment of energy is sufficient to allow rich hierarchies to form, job specializations to develop, and large works of architecture to be built. With sufficient surplus energy, humans can construct remarkably complex creations in short order, as these pictures of oil-rich Dubai taken only 17 years apart attest. Now we can state the 13th key concept of the crash course. Social complexity relies on surplus energy. Societies that unwillingly lose complexity are notoriously unpleasant places to live. Given this, shouldn't we pay close attention to how much surplus energy we've got and where it comes from? This is why we're going to take a quick tour through the concept of energy budgeting. It's the same as household budgeting, but we leave dollars out of the equation. It works like this. At any given time, there is a defined amount of energy that is available to use as we wish. Let's put everything into this yellow square: solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, coal, petroleum, natural gas, and anything I've happened to miss. That's our total energy budget, and we can use it any way we wish. But if we want to have more energy next year, we obviously are going to have to invest some of that back into finding more energy. And then we'll also have to invest some in building and maintaining the capital structure that allows us to collect and distribute that energy. and to maintain a complex society. Roads, pipelines, bridges, electrical pylons, and buildings all go into this category of capital. Now, what's left over can be used for consumption. Part of this goes to basic living needs, such as water, food, and shelter, leaving the rest for discretionary things like trips to the Galapagos and hula hoops or attending Burning Man. To simplify this even more, we can divide energy up into two big buckets: energy that must be reinvested to keep everything going, and energy that we can more or less choose what to do with. This is exactly analogous to your earnings. Suppose that your household earns $50,000 a year, and your total taxes are 30%, or $15,000. This leaves you $35,000 to buy food, pay for your shelter, purchase gasoline for your car, and maybe do a few other things besides. If this suddenly flipped around, and you found yourself with only $15,000 of take-home pay, your situation would change drastically. Perhaps you could only afford food and shelter, while the car and electronics and maybe vacations became distant memories. Your life would be forcibly simplified in terms of the number of things that you could afford to buy or do. So I want you to begin to think of the amount of energy that we have to reinvest in order to get more energy as the same thing as an unavoidable tax on your salary. And here's why. Forget all about how much money energy costs, because it's actually irrelevant, especially when money is printed out of thin air. Instead, we're going to focus on how much energy it takes to get energy, because as I'm going to show you, that is what really matters. Fortunately, the concept's easy, and it's called net energy. The way we're going to measure this is by dividing the amount of energy we get by the amount of energy we had to use in order to get that energy. Energy out over energy in. Energy in is the tax, while the energy out is your take-home pay. Imagine that if the total energy it took to get an oil well drilled was 1 barrel of oil and 100 barrels was found. We'd say that our net energy return was 100 to 1. In this example, the tax we paid out was 1 out of 100, or 1%. Another phrase for this that you may encounter is energy returned on energy invested, which goes by the acronym EROEI. We're just going to stick with energy out divided by energy in for this section, or net energy, as it's easier to visualize and it's essentially the same thing. Now, let's make this visual by graphically comparing the relationship between energy out and energy in. The red part is the amount of energy we have to put in, and the green part is how much we got out, or the net energy. And we're displaying them such that they always sum to 100%. In this first scenario, the energy out divided by energy in yields a value of 50, meaning that 1 unit of energy was used to find and produce 50 units of energy. In other words, 2% was used to find and produce energy, leaving us a net 98% to use however we see fit. We could also call this part the surplus energy available to society. Even at a net energy ratio of only 15, the surplus energy available to society remains quite high. This surplus energy, of course, is what supports all of our economic growth, our technological progress, and our wonderfully rich and complicated society. Now, I want to draw your attention to what happens over here on this part of the chart between the readings of 10 and 5. The net energy available to society begins to drop off in a manner that should be familiar to you after seeing the section on exponential charts. Only this hockey stick points down. Below a reading of 5, and the chart heads down in earnest, hitting 0 when it gets to a reading of 1. When it takes 1 unit of energy to get a unit of energy, there is 0 surplus, and there's really no point in going through the trouble of getting it. Below a reading of 5, we are on the energy cliff. To find out why this is an enormously important chart, let's look at our experience with net energy with respect to oil. In 1930, for every barrel of oil used to find oil, it is estimated that 100 were produced, giving us a reading of 100 to 1, which would be way off this chart to the left. By 1970, fields were a lot smaller and the oil often deeper or otherwise trickier to extract, and the net energy gain was now down to a value of 25 to 1. Still, a very good return with lots of green beneath it. By the 1990s, this trend continued, with oil finds returning somewhere between 18 and 10 to 1. And today, it is estimated that recent oil finds are returning only 3 to 1 net energy. Why is this net yield dropping? Because in the past, a relatively small amount of energy was required to create the metal for a smallish rig, and the finds were massive and plentiful and relatively shallow. Today, much more energy is required to find energy. Exploration ships and rigs are massive. If we put our humble 1930s rig to scale, it looks like this. And today, more wells are being drilled to greater depths to find and produce smaller and smaller fields, all of which weigh upon our net energy return. And what about the allegedly massive amounts of oil contained within the so-called tar sands and oil shales, the ones that are often described as equivalent to several Saudi Arabias? The net energy values for these are especially poor and in no way comparable to the 100-to-1 returns found in Saudi Arabia. Further, the water and environmental costs associated with them are disturbingly high. And what about renewable energy sources? Methanol, which can be made from biomass, sports a net energy of about 3, while biodiesel offers a net energy return of somewhere around 2. Corn-based ethanol, if we're generous, might produce a net energy return of just slightly over 1, but could also be negative according to some sources. If we add in all the other new sources for usable liquid fuels that we just talked about, we see that they are all somewhere on the face of the cliff. Unless we very rapidly find ways of boosting the net energy of these options, we'll simply find far less surplus energy for our basic needs and discretionary wants. Solar and wind are both capable of producing pretty high net returns, but these are producing electricity, not liquid fuels, for which we already have an extensive investment in distribution and use. Oh, and by the way, where's the so-called hydrogen economy on this chart? Right here. Because there are no hydrogen reservoirs anywhere on Earth, every single bit of it has to be created from some other source of energy, at a loss. In other words, hydrogen is an energy sink. In creating hydrogen, we always lose energy, and that's not pessimism, that's the law. The second law of thermodynamics, to be exact. Because hydrogen is a carrier of energy, not a source, it is more accurately described like this: a battery. Now, to make an absurd argument, because nobody would be this foolish, suppose Congress made the decision to, say, try and run our society on corn-based ethanol. What could we expect there? Well, if we adjust our graph to reflect that decision, we'll see a whole lot of red and very little green. The tax is very high, while our take-home pay is very low. By way of commentary, I find it somewhat telling that out of all the possible alternative energy sources, this is the one that Congress chose to advance. I mean, short of directly launching barrels of oil into outer space, it's hard to imagine a much more foolish idea. The important point here, though, is that even if the government completely subsidized ethanol to the point that it only cost you a penny a gallon to buy, we would soon find ourselves ruined. And the reasons why have already been covered. With less surplus energy, less societal complexity is possible. Under an ethanol regime, we'd find that many cherished job positions would simply vanish. Regulatory compliance specialists for food additives would have to revert to being farmers. Pediatric radiological oncologists would become healers. And Midwest regional communications coordinators for Special Olympics would have to find something else to do. And so on. If we tried to live on ethanol as a liquid fuel, we'd quickly lose nearly all of the specialized jobs that we associate with modern society, because there would be practically no surplus energy to use in support of that complexity. This diagram, with a rich balance of reinvested and consumed energy, would rapidly become this. Because of their low net energy, ethanol and other such poor energy sources are thoroughly incompatible with our current lifestyles. This turns into this. So let's review the two key concepts so far before moving on. Number 13, the price of energy is irrelevant. Net energy is everything. On this basis, both corn-based ethanol and hydrogen are dismal failures. Key concept number 14, social complexity is built upon surplus energy. If we want to maintain our society in its current form, we're going to have to master this concept and fast. Now, on to Chapter 17C, Energy and the Economy. Thank you for listening. Okay, now we are finally ready to marry the economy to energy. In a recent interview, Peter Schiff of Euro-Pacific Capital described economics as the science of satisfying unlimited demand with limited resources. Given our druthers, most humans would choose to live the life of a billionaire, but this is clearly not possible, even with our current massive abundance of surplus energy. Luckily for us, we've had massive amounts of surplus energy to work with over the past 100 years. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Remember all these exponential graphs? In theory, there's nothing problematic with living in a world full of exponential growth and depletion curves, as long as the world does not have any boundaries. However, exponential functions take on enormous importance when they approach a physical boundary, as seems to be the case for oil in the very near future. Both discoveries and production indicate that we could be at oil's exponential boundary already. Population, money, and oil demand are all exhibiting exponential behavior. Of the three, we can make a very strong case that both population and our money system are utterly dependent on the continued expansion of oil energy. And here are the questions that arise from that line of thinking. What if our exponentially based economic and monetary systems, rather than being the sophisticated culmination of human evolution, are really just an artifact of oil? What if all of our rich societal complexity and all of our trillions of dollars of wealth and debt simply are the human expression of surplus energy pumped from the ground? It's an interesting thought. More immediately, you and I would be perfectly within our rights to wonder what will happen when, not if, but when oil begins to decline. What will happen to our exponential debt-based money system during this period? Is it even possible for it to function in a world without constant growth? These are important questions and they deserve serious answers. And by placing oil consumption on a 4,000-year timeline, all sorts of troubling questions pop up when we overlay the population curve on top of it. Together, these graphs say that we might want just a little dose of adult-sized planning to go with our usual election year hoopla. Central banking just happened to come into maturity coincident with an exponentially exploitable energy source and became all-powerful and revered within a very short period of time. Fiat money systems have come and gone, but this one had a trillion-barrel energy tailwind that is about to turn into a headwind. Distributing ever larger shares of money during a period of constant growth is a pleasant job that enjoys broad political and popular support. Operating in a world of declining energy is an utterly new prospect for every single political and financial institution. And so now it is up to us, you and me, to wonder what we should expect in the future from a money system whose most very basic assumption of them all might be an error. What if the assumption that the future will not just be bigger, but exponentially bigger than the present is incorrect? This assumption is on full display in the debt chart of the US as compared to GDP. The red circle betrays a profound belief that the future will be much, much larger than the present. Consider that the total economy of the US is only some $14 trillion, while the total credit market debt of the US is more than $49 trillion. Lop off a few zeros and round things off, and this is the exact same thing as a bank loaning $500,000 for a home against a salary of $140,000. If we knew that the current tax bracket of the borrower was going to double and then triple again, would this be a good loan to make? To our nation, the end of cheap oil means a sustained and permanent reduction in our after-tax take-home pay. My question is, who in their right mind loans more and more money to someone whose earnings are all but guaranteed to decline? Here's how it all sums up for me. There are some knowns. We know that energy is the source for all growth and complexity. We know that surplus energy is shrinking. We know that the age of easy oil is over. And we know that because of this, oil costs will consume an ever greater proportion of our total budget. And because of these knowns, there are some risks that come along. There is the risk that our exponential money system will cease to operate in a world of declining energy surplus. It might simply not be suited to the task. And there is the risk that our society will be forced to become less complex. If you really think about it, that is a loaded sentence right there. And finally, there is the risk that even as oil winds down, the momentum of the money system will create conditions ripe for hyperinflation. Each one of these knowns adds to each one of these risks, and that is what this course is all about, assessing those risks and deciding what, if anything, a prudent adult should do about adapting to these realities and facing these risks. When I put these together, I feel comfortable making these predictions. Remember, I reserve the right to change these with the arrival of new information at a later date. The status quo will be preserved at all costs. Politicians will hide the truth, economic statistics will become even fuzzier, and central banks will continue to throw more and more money at a system that, at its core, is out of tune with reality. Number 2, hyperinflation will result. The price of anything is a function of how many dollars are floating around and how much of that product or good there happens to be. Because literally every single failed fiat currency regime has failed for the same reasons, we can reasonably conclude that the future will be filled with ever more dollars. At the same time, declining surplus energy will assure that there are fewer goods floating around. Together, these spell inflation. Number 3 is the logical outflow of numbers 1 and 2. Standards of living will decline. However, I am living proof that even as one's standard of living declines, one's quality of life can go up. Yet, it is entirely possible that I am raising issues here that will play out over many years or even decades, and almost certainly will be influenced by changes in behavior and technology. But the point cannot be denied. We are squandering precious time and remaining energy in a desperate, certainly foolish, and possibly ultimately unpleasant bid to preserve the status quo. We must not fall into this trap. And on that note, we're almost through. Next, we tie the first 2 E's to the environment, where I will focus on the exponential extraction of resources and modification and depletion of critical support systems. Please join me for Chapter 18, the environment. Thank you for listening. Congratulations, you have made it to the final chapter of data. The remaining 2 chapters are summaries and conclusions. Let me start right out by saying that this is not going to be about global warming. Instead, I want to focus on more linear, less complicated, and I believe more immediate concerns. The primary intent of the crash course is to show you that there's a bit of a disconnect between an exponential money system that enforces a creed of constant growth and living on a spherical planet. In this section, a lot of you are going to find out that the planet is a whole lot smaller than you might have thought. Most of the reason is contained in this curve right here, population. Consider that the entire human population finally reached 3 billion people in 1960, and that projections call for adding another 3 billion people in only 42 more years. Before we contemplate 50% more humans in only 40 years, let me show you the pickle in which the current crop already finds itself. This year, there will be 70 million more humans on the surface of the planet than last year. 70 million. To put that in context, that is nearly 3 times as many people as live in the top 10 most populous U.S. cities combined. Worldwide population growth is equivalent to 3 of each of these cities each year for the next 40 years. More people means more demand for resources, more aluminum, more food, more consumer goods shipped to more places, and more cars. Always more cars. And in case anybody has the misperception that maybe this isn't such a big deal because maybe these people will be living in China in a dirt hovel with maybe a donkey in a wicker basket, let me show you one of the fastest growing cities in the world. In many respects, it is newer and more modern than most Western cities. This is what everybody aspires to. And people are the same the world over. We all want to live in bright, shiny cities, and we want to shop for nice things in nice districts. As a quick aside, China is said to have between 1.3 and 1.6 billion citizens. This means that the entire U.S. population of 300 million people, or 0.3 billion, would be referred to by the Chinese as a rounding error. In fact, if we combine the top 5 most populous cities in the U.S., we'd find that they would have fewer inhabitants than the largest city in China. But I want to return to the earlier statement that over the next 40 years, another 3 billion people will crowd onto the surface of the planet. One trait that humans share with all organisms is that we use the easiest to obtain and the highest quality resources first. When we use the Earth's resources, we start with the richest, deepest soils, with the largest trees, and the richest fishing waters. That is, we naturally exploit the highest quality resources first. At this point, I want to recall that oil is a finite natural resource, and because of this, we find that individual oil fields and collections of oil exhibit a classic extraction profile that resembles a bell curve. We can broaden this concept to create a generalized resource extraction profile, where we start with the closest, richest, and most accessible and highest grade resources first, before moving on to successively harder and poorer and thinner or more distant resources. What this means is that over time, the energy required to obtain those resources goes up, as do the costs. About this, there really can be no doubt. Here's an example. When we first came to this country, we were finding some pretty spectacular things just lying around, like this copper nugget. Soon, these were all gone, and we were onto smaller nuggets, and then onto copper ores that had some of the highest concentrations. Now we have things like the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah. It is 2.5 miles across and 3/4 of a mile deep, and it started out as a mountain. It sports a final ore concentration of just 0.2%. Do you think we'd have gone to all this effort if there were still massive copper nuggets lying around in a stream bed? No way. Let's take a closer look. You see that truck way down there? It's fueled by petroleum, diesel specifically. If we couldn't spare the diesel to run that truck, what do you suppose we'd carry the ore out with? Donkeys? These trucks carry 255 tons per load. Supposing a donkey could carry 150 pounds, this means this truck carries the same in a single load as 3,400 donkeys. That's quite a lot of donkeys. My point here is that a hole in the ground a couple of miles across and 3/4 of a mile deep is a pretty spectacular display of the use of energy. When energy begins to get scarce, it seems unlikely to me that we'll be digging too many more holes like it, which means copper will become scarce. Now here's where the concept gets interesting. The amount of energy and money that is required to extract any mineral or metal is a function of the ore grade. We would measure that as the percent of the ore that consists of the desired substance. So a 10% copper ore, for example, would contain 10% copper and 90% other stuff, like, rocks or something. If we plot out how much other stuff we have to extract and then dispose of in pursuit of our desired substance, we get a chart that looks like this. Does this look familiar to you? It should. It's an exponential chart. It tells us that if we had an ore body with only 0.2% copper in it, we'd need to mine 500 pounds of ore in order to extract 1 pound of copper. I used this particular value because that happens to be the concentration of the Bingham Canyon mine. This helps to explain why this hole is so big. It tells us that without these giant trucks, we probably wouldn't be mining such low ore grades. It means that we are already on the far right edge of this bell curve in terms of energy and cost. Do we do this because we like the challenge of low ore grades? No, we do it because we've already high-graded all the other known ore bodies, and this is what we're down to. We do it because it's the best option left. We do it because in only 200 years, we've already burned through all of the better grades. Let's look at another example, coal. Coal production, as measured by tons mined, has been steadily growing at 2% a year since the 1940s. This sort of stable, continuous exponential growth is exactly what our economy and society demand. President Bush recently said that we have 250 years of coal left, implying that this red arrow can continue in this direction for another 250 years. In other words, there is no urgency here, just a whole lot of coal waiting for us to come and get it. But there's a wrinkle in this story. Coal comes in several different grades. The most desirable is shiny, hard, black anthracite coal. It yields the most heat when burned and has a low moisture content and is highly valued in the steelmaking industry. Then comes bituminous coal, offering slightly less energy per pound of weight, and then subbituminous, and then finally something called lignite, which is really low energy, high moisture stuff called brown coal that is pretty much only useful for burning. The next grade below lignite is rocks, which burn only slightly less vigorously than lignite. Let's look at the U.S. history with mining anthracite. Notice a trend here? The reason we're not mining more of the stuff is because it's pretty much all gone. Our entire bequeathment of anthracite, formed over hundreds of millions of years, was largely used over a span of about 100 years. So we moved on to the next best stuff, bituminous coal. And here we might note that a peak in production was actually hit in 1990. Was this because we lost interest in this better grade of coal? No, it simply means that we started to run out of it. Naturally, we then moved on to the next grade, subbituminous coal, which we can see here making up the difference. And even lignite is getting into the game, although I don't expect to see this line really begin to move up until the subbituminous coal production has peaked out. Now we get to the really interesting part. Remember I said that the heat content or available free energy of coal got progressively worse with each grade? If we plot the total energy content of the coal mined instead of the tonnage, we get a very different picture. where the tonnage has been moving up in a nice, steady, neat 2% climb. We note that the total energy has leveled off and has climbed by exactly 0% over the last 9 years. So we're using more energy and spending more money to mine more and more coal, but we're receiving less and less back from those efforts? Let's bring back this image again. Where do you think we are on this curve with respect to coal? Are the best years still in front of us? Do you feel secure with the 250 years of coal that the president has said we have left? The net energy of coal varies quite widely, but in extracting lignite, we are already pretty far down this net energy curve. Well, that's okay. We can switch to uranium, right? It turns out there's a little wrinkle in this story, too. When we look at the ore grades that exist for uranium, we see that they range from a high of over 20% to as low as 0.007%. Of all the ore grades proven and inferred to exist, 30% of them are greater than 0.1% in purity, leaving 70% below the grade of 0.1%. Only one country, Canada, has proven reserves at a higher grade than 1%, while 11 countries have already entirely exhausted their uranium ores. When we consider ore grades in such extremely low concentrations, the mining yields are quite dramatic, but not in a good way. Here's where 70% of the known uranium reserves lie, requiring that anywhere from 500 pounds to 10,000 pounds of ore body be removed and processed to obtain a single pound of the mineral, uranium oxide. Clearly, as with copper, we are slipping down a slope of declining ore concentrations for uranium, and it cannot be disputed that greater energy and cost is demanded at this end of the curve. Just in the sake of interest, France gets 90% of its electricity from nuclear power, but their uranium extraction peaked in the late 1980s, while the US passed its mining peak in the early 1980s. Both countries are well past peak uranium. If uranium is the energy of the future lies somewhere outside of these two countries. In fact, this same general theme naturally applies to anything we humans set our attention to. Phosphorus, essential mineral for farming, fish in the oceans, and every single source of metal are all telling the same story. We are running out of high-grade materials. For most things, there is either already a shortage or one will soon arise within the next few decades. And even these assessments assume that sufficient energy exists, allowing us to dig as many mile-deep pits as we wish in our quest for the last low-grade ores. The story here is that we as a species, all over the globe, have already mined the richest ores, found the easiest energy sources, and farmed the richest soils. It is said that for every bushel of wheat taken to market, a bushel of topsoil is lost. In that sense, given that it takes hundreds of years to form a single inch of topsoil, it can be said that our farmers are actually mining the soil. We have taken several hundreds of millions of years of natural ore body and energy deposition, and thousands of years of soil creation, and largely burned through them in the few years since oil was discovered. It is safe to say that in human terms, once these are gone, man, they're gone. Another measure of human activity is that certain sensitive ecosystem stress markers are showing up. Species loss is one example, but there are many others, such as the dead zones that are appearing all over the globe in the shallow seas. In fact, if one cares to look, there are red lights flashing all over our collective dashboard, ranging from species loss to oceanic depletion to aquifer depletion to topsoil loss, energy depletion, and so on. When I get even one red warning light on my dashboard, I pull right over to see what's wrong. So far, my sense is that the world is stepping on the gas pedal instead. And driving every single bit of this is simply this: 70 million new people arrive on the surface of the planet each year. This means that a stunning 50% increase in the number of humans clamoring for natural resources will have to be negotiated over the next 40 years. If we get clever about this, my sense is that we can do just fine. If we simply choose to grow, though, because that's what our money system requires, and that's the default position for our politicians, then it seems likely that we'll simply go faster until we hit a wall. The choice seems clear. Either we undertake voluntary change now, or we face involuntary change later. Now, back to the economy. Its primary assumption that the future will not just be bigger, but exponentially bigger than the present, is going to have to contend with this reality. I submit to you that these limits are going to play out in very real terms over the next 20 years. And so we can finally put all three E's into one spot. Our economy is based on an exponential money system that explicitly enforces a paradigm of continuous growth and implicitly assumes that the future will be much larger than the present. Growth requires energy. There's no getting around that. So the trends in energy stand in stark contrast to the major underlying assumption upon which our entire economy and our entire way of life are founded. Peak energy is a very real, very close prospect. In the rest of the environment, we see very clearly that we humans have high-graded virtually every resource, and we are now working our way into poorer, thinner, and deeper territory as we seek the resources that define our lifestyles. Biosystem stress is flashing warning signs on our dashboard. Pretending that we can just carry on consuming as we have while the world population increases by another 50% over the next 40 years is just not a workable plan. In fact, it's no plan at all. The continued exponential extraction of resources is a difficult enough story to believe just given the depleting ore grades that we are witnessing. But when we combine that reality with what we know about our energy supplies, then the story becomes even more unworkable. Because each of the key environmental resources upon which we depend, metals and minerals, soil, water, oceanic fish, and all the rest, have been high-graded, their continued extraction is going to increasingly be in competition for dwindling energy supplies that we'd also like to use to transport ourselves, to construct buildings, and to stay warm. Taken together, it becomes quite clear that our challenge is to adapt to a world of less, not more. A world where we have to put more energy into carefully managing what we have than seeking out new sources to exploit. We have an economic system that must grow, coupled to an energy system that can't grow, both of which are linked to a world of rapidly depleting resources. Out of the 3 E's, this is the one that is going to be doing the changing, and you need to be ready for that. That's what this entire crash course has been about. Let me make this even simpler. I want to be sure to get this point across very clearly. Our economy must grow to support a money system that requires growth, but is challenged by an energy system that can't grow. And both of these are linked to a natural world that is rapidly being depleted. Let me close by saying that if I thought these represented unfixable problems, I would not have dedicated full-time the last 4 years of my life developing this crash course and raided my bank account to make it freely available to all. I am an optimist, and I want a better future of our own design. We can no longer afford pleasant platitudes about 250 years of coal left without appreciating the actual details involved. It's time to think big. Develop a clear sense of priorities, and cast off the adolescent view that nothing bad is going to happen to us because so far it hasn't. And it's time to show that we care about future generations. For better or worse, you happen to be alive at one of the most dramatic turning points in our species' history that ranks right up there with climbing down out of the trees. The only real question is, what role do you want to play? Shall your life be filled with fear or a resolute sense of purpose? The only way these challenges can become insurmountable is if we let them by ignoring them for too long. Okay, it's time to place all of these challenges onto a single timeline so that we can assess the urgency of the risks that we face. Please join me for Chapter 19, Future Shock. Thank you for your attention. You are now at that part of the crash course where everything you learn comes together into a single spot. What I am offering is a comprehensive view of how all our problems are actually interrelated and need to be viewed as such, or solutions will continue to elude us. So let's review the key trends which appear to be converging on a very narrow window of the future. We began with an understanding of money, and the fact that our money is loaned into existence with interest, and that this results in powerful pressures to keep the amount of credit, or money, constantly growing by some percentage every year. This is the very definition of exponential growth, which we can easily see in our money, and of course, inflation charts. Keeping this dynamic in mind, we encountered the data on debt, which is really a claim on the future, vastly exceeding all historical benchmarks. The flip side to this, but a significant sociological trend in its own right, is the steady erosion of savings observed over the exact same period of time. Combined, we have the highest levels of debt ever recorded, coincident with some of the lowest levels of savings ever recorded. And we saw that our failure to save extends through all levels of our society and even includes a desperate failure to invest in our infrastructure. Next, we saw how assets, primarily housing, have been in a sustained bubble, and that is now bursting, and will take many years to play out. When credit bubbles burst, they result in financial panics that end up destroying a lot of capital. Actually, that's not quite right. This quote says it better. Panics do not destroy capital. They merely reveal the extent to which it has been previously destroyed by its betrayal into hopelessly unproductive works. So we learned that a bursting bubble is not something that's easily fixed by authorities because their attempts to limit further damage are misplaced. The damage has already been done. It is contained within too many houses and too many strip malls sold for too high prices, and too many goods imported and bought on credit. All of that is done. All that's left is figuring out who ends up holding the bag, and right now, these guys are working hard to assure that that's you, the taxpayer. Then we learned that the most profound U.S. government financial shortfalls rest with a demographic problem that itself cannot be fixed by any act of law or any level of optimism. It is simply a fact. An inconvenient fact of circumstance, much like gravity sometimes, but a fact nonetheless. Even more than this, we learn that the assets boomers use to describe their wealth, stocks and bonds and real estate, all have to be sold to somebody at some point in order to extract their value. And we raise the uncomfortable observation that there simply are fewer people behind the boomers to whom these assets can be sold. When sellers exceed buyers, values fall. Through all of this, the economic numbers that we reported to ourselves were systematically debased until they no longer reflected reality. If false data leads to bad decisions, then it's no wonder that we find ourselves in our current predicament. Only by returning to an honest self-appraisal can we plot a strategic and meaningful course to the future. Then we learn that energy is the source of all economic activity and that oil is by far the most important source of energy. Our entire economic configuration is built around the assumption of unlimited growth in energy supplies, but this is an easily refuted proposition. Individual oil fields peak, and so do collections of them. And so peak oil is not so much a theory as it is an observation about how oil fields age. We then explored the tension that obviously exists between a monetary system that enforces exponential growth and the fact that our primary energy source has either already peaked or will soon. Somehow, the U.S. has not even begun to invest in a future without cheap oil. We have no plan B. Lastly, we noted that the environment, meaning the world's resources and natural systems upon which we depend, is exhibiting clear signs that our exponential population is driving exponential exploitation of resources, hastening their final depletion and altering ecosystems at an alarming rate. Also, we learned that even minor changes to the systems we depend on, such as shifting rainfall patterns, can create massive, usually unplanned costs that will take priority over other needs. And yes, we've faced problems before and will face these as well. The concern comes when we view them all at once. Placed on a timeline, we see that a bursting housing bubble is already happening just as the first wave of boomers enters retirement. At the same time, peak oil demand will outstrip supply, forcing an enormously expensive adjustment, even as unknowable costs associated with resource depletion and a shifting climate lurk in the not-too-distant future. And sitting over all of this, limiting our options, will be our national failure to save and invest, and historically unprecedented levels of debt. This timeline, stretching from now to 2020, reveals a truly massive set of challenges converging on an exceptionally short window of time. The question becomes, where will the money come from to apply to each of these challenges if our savings are depleted and our debt levels are already in uncharted territory? Any one of these events will prove to be a difficult strain on our national economy, while any two could be disruptive. If three or more happen simultaneously, it's not hard to foresee the economic destruction of our country as a result, or perhaps the dollar utterly ruined as a store of wealth. How many trillions will be required to fund boomer retirement? How many trillions to reshape our transportation infrastructure to accommodate peak oil? Where will the tens of trillions come from to make up shortfalls in pensions and entitlement programs? How do we make good on these pension and entitlement promises while burdened with the highest debt loads ever seen? Where does the money come from to clean up the aftermath of a bursting housing bubble? How much more expensive will food and minerals be in the future when oil is peaked, but many more people are placing higher demands on increasingly marginal resources? Each of these key trends or threats will take years, if not decades, to address, and yet we find them all parked almost directly in front of us without any serious national discussions or planning. With every passing day, we squander precious time while the problems grow larger and more costly, if not thoroughly intractable. Buying time is not a strategy and will prove to be a disastrous tactic. The mark of a mature adult is someone who can manage complexity and plans ahead. My opinion is that with few exceptions, the current political and corporate leadership of this country are doing neither. We need to change this. It is long past time to give up the adolescent notion that we can have our cake, eat it too, and borrow more when it's gone. It is time, quite simply, to return to living within our natural and economic budgets. We need to set priorities, set a budget, and stick to both. And you? If you haven't already, you need to begin to embrace the possibility that the path to the future might not be straight. It may take a few twists and turns and end up somewhere entirely unexpected. And that you happen to be alive at one of the most interesting points in human history, a time when a great shift may occur. This can be frightening or it can be exhilarating, and that choice is yours. So what do we do about all this? What can you do, and what steps should you be considering right now? Please join me for the final chapter of the crash course. Thank you for listening.